I watched my sister's $98,000 wedding unfold at my beachfront estate, a Mediterranean villa worth $12 million that no one knew I owned. 200 guests in designer gowns clinked champagne glasses under crystal chandeliers, while Sarah, Radiant, and Vera Wang played the blushing bride. When she spotted me standing quietly in the corner, her smile turned venomous. "Oh, that's just Christina," she announced to a group of tech CEOs and senators, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "She's basically the beach cleaner around here. Poor thing doesn't do much with her life, but she tries her best." The guests laughed. My parents said nothing. I'd spent 45 years being invisible in this family, so I simply smiled. Then Marcus, the head butler, entered the room. "Madam Walsh," he said, bowing directly to me. "Shall we proceed with the $8,000 customized menu?" The silence was deafening. Sarah's face drained of color. Her hands trembled so violently that her wineglass slipped from her fingers and shattered across the marble floor. But that humiliating moment, that was just the beginning. Because 7 years ago, I saved our family's company from $4.2 million in debt and total bankruptcy. And my dear sister didn't just take credit for my work, she systematically erased me from history, altered corporate documents, and built an empire of lies on the foundation of my silence. Now the truth is about to detonate like a bomb at her perfect wedding. And trust me, by the time this is over, she'll wish the wineglass was the only thing that shattered today. My name is Christina Walsh. I'm 45 years old, and until recently, I held the title of Vice President of Finance at Walsh Corporation, the commercial real estate firm my grandfather built in 1952. What most people don't know is that 7 years ago, I single-handedly saved that company from complete financial collapse. And today, I'm standing at my own beachfront estate watching my younger sister take credit for everything I've ever accomplished. The irony isn't lost on me. Sarah's wedding was exactly what you'd expect from someone who's spent the last several years constructing an elaborate fiction about her own importance. $98,000 for a single day, a number that would make most people's heads spin. But when you're marrying into tech money and trying to impress Silicon Valley royalty, apparently that's just the starting point. The venue she'd chosen for this spectacle was my Mediterranean-style villa perched on 3 acres of California coastline with unobstructed views of the Pacific. The property is worth $12 million, a fact that precisely 0 people at this wedding knew, because I'd spent the last decade keeping that particular truth to myself. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, watching the late afternoon sun paint everything in shades of gold and amber. The interior designer Sarah had hired had transformed my home into something that belonged in a luxury wedding magazine. White roses, easily 10,000 stems of them, cascaded from crystal vases on every surface. Gold accents caught the light from 3 massive chandeliers I'd had installed 2 years ago. Silk draping in cream and champagne hung from the vaulted ceilings, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. It was beautiful, I had to admit. Sarah had always had an eye for aesthetics, even if she'd never developed much substance to go with it. 200 guests filled the great room, and I recognized most of them. There was Senator Patricia Morrison, whose environmental legislation had shaped California's development policies for the last decade. James Chen, the CEO of a biotech firm that had just gone public for $3 billion. The founder of a venture capital fund that managed $800 million in assets. These were people who operated at the highest levels of business and politics, and every single one of them thought my sister was someone worth knowing. I'd deliberately chosen to wear a simple navy dress, nothing designer, nothing that would draw attention. The fabric was quality, the cut flattering enough for a woman my age, but it was the kind of thing you'd forget the moment I left the room. I wanted to disappear into the background to observe without being observed. It's a skill I'd perfected over 45 years of being the daughter who didn't need attention, the sister who stayed in the shadows, the executive who let her work speak for itself. Except my work hadn't spoken for itself, had it? It had been systematically silenced while someone else's voice grew louder with each passing year. A young waiter, probably in his early 20s and hired for the event by Sarah's wedding planner, approached with a tray of champagne. I was thirsty. I'd been standing for nearly an hour, and I quietly asked if he might bring me some water instead. He glanced at me briefly, then his eyes slid past me toward a cluster of guests near the bar where Sarah was holding court. "I'll try to get to that," he said dismissively, already turning away. "We're focusing on the important guests right now." I watched him walk away, and something in my chest tightened. Not anger exactly. I'd moved beyond anger years ago. This was something closer to resignation, the dull ache of a wound that never quite healed, because it kept being reopened. The reception toast began about 20 minutes later. Sarah's maid of honor. A college friend whose name I couldn't remember clinked her glass with a silver spoon, and the room gradually quieted. She delivered a speech full of inside jokes and sentimental memories talking about Sarah's ambition, her brilliance, her determination. Then Sarah's new husband, Preston Whitmore III, stood and spoke about how he'd fallen in love with the most remarkable woman in business, someone who'd saved her family's company from the brink of disaster and revolutionized crisis management in the real estate industry. I felt my fingernails dig into my palms. Then Sarah herself stood radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. She looked every inch the successful executive bride, confident, polished, beloved. She thanked Preston's parents, who'd apparently contributed to the wedding budget despite their son being worth $40 million in his own right. She thanked the wedding planner, the florist, even the string quartet playing softly in the corner. She turned to our parents seated at the head table and delivered a touching tribute to their support and guidance. My name never came up. The omission was so glaring that I saw several guests glance in my direction, clearly wondering about the absent acknowledgement. But Sarah wasn't done yet. With perfect timing, she paused, pressed her hand to her heart, and added with a smile that managed to be both sweet and condescending. "And of course, I can't forget my big sister Christina, who's always been so supportive in her own quiet way." A few guests nodded approvingly, as if this were a generous inclusion. "Christina doesn't do much these days," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a tone of gentle pity that made my skin crawl. "But she tries her best, and I love her for that." Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Not cruel laughter. These were sophisticated people who would never be overtly mean, but the kind of amused, knowing chuckles that indicated they understood the subtext. Poor Christina, the less accomplished Walsh daughter, the one who never quite measured up. I kept my face carefully neutral, the same expression I'd maintained through countless family dinners, board meetings, and professional gatherings where my contributions were minimized or erased entirely. My parents, seated 15 feet away at a table decorated with peonies and gold-rimmed china, said absolutely nothing. My father, Richard Walsh, looked mildly uncomfortable but didn't correct the narrative. My mother, Eleanor, simply smiled and raised her champagne glass. It was in that moment of carefully orchestrated humiliation that Marcus appeared. He'd been my head of household staff for 8 years. A dignified man in his early 60s who'd previously worked for a family in Newport Beach before I'd convinced him to join my significantly smaller operation. Marcus moved through the crowd with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of service in high-end estates. He carried a silver tray with fresh champagne flutes, but he walked directly past the wedding party and approached me. "Madam Walsh," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the surrounding guests. "I wanted to confirm the final details for this evening's service. Shall we proceed with the customized menu as planned, or would you prefer any adjustments?" The room didn't go completely silent. There were still pockets of conversation near the bar and by the windows, but a noticeable hush fell over the immediate area. I saw heads turn. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Sarah's smile froze on her face. For just a fraction of a second, so brief that most people probably missed it, I saw something flash in her eyes. Not surprise. Not confusion. Something much darker and much older. It was hatred pure and distilled, the kind that doesn't develop overnight but accumulates slowly year after year until it becomes the foundation of everything you do. Then she laughed, bright and dismissive. "Marcus still calls my sister that from the old days. she explained to the nearby guests, waving her hand as if brushing away an amusing misunderstanding. When we were younger, Christina used to help manage some of the family properties. He's just being sweet and nostalgic. But I noticed that her hand trembled slightly as she raised her champagne glass. I noticed that William Chen, a member of our board of directors who was standing near the French doors, leaned over to whisper something to his wife. I noticed that several guests were now looking at me with new interest, reassessing the woman in the simple navy dress who'd been so easily dismissed moments earlier. Marcus, to his credit, maintained his professional composure. He didn't argue or clarify. He simply inclined his head respectfully and waited for my response, his posture making it abundantly clear to anyone paying attention that he knew exactly who he reported to. And in that moment, standing in my own home, while 200 people celebrated a woman who'd built her empire on the systematic theft of my accomplishments, I made a decision. I'd been silent for 45 years. I'd let my work speak for itself. Let others take credit. Let peace and family harmony matter more than truth. I was done being invisible. I stood there watching Marcus retreat to oversee the catering staff, and a memory surfaced unbidden, one of those crystalline moments from childhood that you don't realize is shaping you until decades later, when you're standing in your own home being publicly humiliated by your sister, and you finally understand how you got here. I was 8 years old, sitting at the dining room table doing my math homework, while Sarah, 4 years younger, was having a meltdown in the next room because she'd gotten a B- on a spelling test. I remember my mother rushing to console her, my father leaving his study to join the effort, both of them spending 30 minutes reassuring Sarah that one bad grade didn't define her, that she was smart and capable and valued. I finished my homework, a perfect score as usual, and brought it to show my mother. She glanced at it briefly and said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Why don't you go read in your room? Christina is the smart one who doesn't need attention." I was praised for not needing praise, rewarded for not requiring rewards, valued for not demanding value. That phrase became the defining narrative of my childhood, repeated so often by both my parents that I internalized it as fundamental truth about who I was supposed to be. Christina doesn't need help with her homework. Christina doesn't get upset when things don't go her way. Christina is self-sufficient. Christina is easy. And because I was naturally introverted, naturally academically gifted, naturally inclined towards solving problems quietly rather than making a fuss, I fit perfectly into the role they'd created for me. Sarah, on the other hand, received constant attention, constant validation, constant reassurance. Every minor achievement was celebrated. Every setback required family intervention. She learned early that love was loud, that affection was demonstrative, that your worth was measured by how much space you took up in a room and how much attention you demanded. Our parents, Richard and Eleanor Walsh, ran our household the way my father ran his business, with ruthless efficiency and a focus on outcomes over emotions. Feelings were messy. Feelings were inefficient. Much better to have one child who required minimal maintenance so you could focus your limited emotional resources on the child who needed constant care. They weren't cruel people, my parents. They genuinely believed they were playing to our respective strengths, organizing the family system in a way that made sense. What they didn't realize, or perhaps didn't care to examine, was that they were teaching me that love was transactional. Contribute value, stay quiet. Don't make demands and you'll be accepted. Take up space. Ask for recognition. Insist on being seen and you'll be labeled difficult, needy, problematic. I learned to equate self-sacrifice with worthiness. I learned that my value came not from who I was, but from how little trouble I caused and how much I could accomplish without bothering anyone. Near the dessert table, I overheard one of Sarah's friends, a blonde woman in a rose-colored dress, say to her companion, "The quiet ones never cause trouble, do they? That's why families love them." The exact words my mother had used when I was 12, after I'd spent an entire weekend helping my grandmother organize her estate paperwork, while Sarah threw a tantrum about wanting to go to a friend's pool party instead. My mother had patted my head absently and said those words as if they were the highest compliment she could offer. At the time, I'd glowed with pride. Now, at 45, standing in a room full of people who'd just watched me be publicly diminished, I understood what that phrase actually meant. Quiet people are convenient. They don't disrupt. They don't demand. They don't take up oxygen that could be used by louder, more insistent voices. And in a family where resources, financial, emotional, attentional, were finite, I'd been designated as the child who required the least investment. The question that had been forming in my mind for the past 7 years, growing more insistent with each piece of credit Sarah stole, and each accomplishment of mine she erased, finally crystallized into perfect clarity. In a family where the loudest voice writes history, does silence equal consent to your own erasure? I'd spent 45 years operating under the assumption that competence would speak for itself, that if I just worked hard enough, was smart enough, contributed enough value, eventually people would see and acknowledge what I'd done. I'd believed that doing the right thing, making the ethical choice, solving the problem without seeking glory, that these things mattered more than self-promotion or taking credit. I'd genuinely thought that being the person who got things done was more important than being the person who talked about getting things done. I'd been catastrophically wrong. In the absence of self-advocacy, other people don't step in to advocate for you. They don't suddenly recognize your contributions and rush to give you credit. Instead, they allow whoever is willing to claim the credit to have it. Or worse, they actively help rewrite history to favor the person who tells the better story, who gives the more compelling performance, who understands that truth is whatever narrative people choose to believe. The painful, humiliating truth I'd been avoiding for years settled over me like a heavy blanket. My silence wasn't wisdom. It wasn't humility. It wasn't some noble, selfless virtue. It was fear dressed up in respectable clothing, fear of being seen as difficult, fear of being labeled attention-seeking, fear of violating the role I'd been assigned since childhood. The easy daughter, the one who didn't need, who didn't want, who didn't take up space. And that silence, that fear masquerading as maturity, had allowed Sarah to build an entire empire of lies on the foundation of my actual work. But there was something else, something darker that I'd been avoiding examining too closely. As I watched Sarah move through the crowd accepting congratulations and admiration that should have been directed at someone else entirely, a specific memory surfaced from 25 years ago. Sarah was 16 and I was home from college for the weekend. I'd been accepted to Harvard Business School and was planning my future with the kind of single-minded focus that had always come naturally to me. I remember walking past Sarah's bedroom and hearing muffled crying. When I knocked and entered, I found her sitting on her bed surrounded by brochures for Parsons School of Design in New York City. She'd been accepted with a significant scholarship, not a full ride, but substantial. She'd wanted to study art and design since she was 12, had real talent with color and composition that even our artistically indifferent parents acknowledged. Our father had told her that morning that she couldn't accept the scholarship. The family was investing heavily in my Harvard MBA tuition living expenses, the networking opportunities that came with that particular degree, and there simply wasn't enough financial flexibility to support both of us in expensive programs simultaneously. Sarah would attend state school for business instead, something practical, something that would prepare her to eventually work in the family company. I remember standing in her doorway watching her cry, and I remember thinking, well, this is what's best for the family. Harvard was the more strategic investment. My degree would have clearer ROI. Sarah would understand eventually. I said something awkward and insufficient, probably about how state school business programs were perfectly good, and then I left to meet friends for dinner. I was 20 years old, absorbed in my own future, and I genuinely didn't understand the magnitude of what was being taken from her. Or maybe I understood, but didn't care enough to intervene. Maybe I'd been so conditioned to accept the family's utilitarian calculus that I couldn't see how profoundly unfair it was. Now watching Sarah in her Vera Wang gown, playing the role of successful executive and beloved daughter, I found myself wondering, did my unintentional negligence create the monster she became? If I'd stood up for her back then, if I'd insisted our parents find a way to support both of us, if I'd seen her as a whole person with her own dreams, rather than just a logistical problem to be solved, would things be different now? Or was Sarah always capable of this level of calculated cruelty, just waiting for an excuse, a justification, a wound she could point to whenever anyone questioned the ethics of stealing credit for work she didn't do? I didn't know the answer. What I did know was that the woman across the room laughing with tech CEOs and venture capitalists wasn't just an opportunist who'd seized a chance. The systematic way she'd erased me from the story of saving Walsh Corporation, the meticulous construction of a false narrative over years that took planning, that took intent. How long had Sarah been planning to take everything I'd built? The answer to that question required going back 7 years to the spring of 2018, when Walsh Corporation wasn't hosting lavish weddings or celebrating success stories. It was 48 hours away from complete and total collapse. I remember the exact moment I understood how bad things had gotten. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was sitting in my office on the 3rd floor of our headquarters in downtown San Francisco, reviewing quarterly financials that made my stomach turn. Walsh Corporation, the commercial real estate firm my grandfather had built from nothing in 1952, had accumulated $4.2 million in debt. That number alone wasn't catastrophic for a company our size. We'd had debt before, managed it, worked through it. What made this different was the velocity of the crisis, and the fact that everything was happening simultaneously. 3 major investors had pulled out of our flagship Phoenix development project after discovering that the environmental impact assessments had been seriously flawed. The land we'd purchased for $12 million couldn't be developed as planned without millions more in mitigation costs that hadn't been budgeted. Those 3 investors represented $18 million in committed capital that evaporated overnight, leaving us contractually obligated to complete a project we could no longer afford. 7 different creditors, sensing blood in the water, had moved from patient negotiations to aggressive legal positioning. We were receiving letters from attorneys threatening lawsuits that would tie up our assets and potentially force liquidation. The company employed 45 people, good people, many of whom had been with us for decades. They had families, mortgages, kids in college. If Walsh Corporation went under, they'd all be scrambling for new positions in a commercial real estate market that was already contracting. But beyond the employees, there was an even more terrifying dimension to the crisis. My father, as CEO, had personally guaranteed several of the largest loans during better times, a common practice in family businesses, but one that now meant the Walsh family faced personal bankruptcy. We could lose everything: the company, our homes, our savings, the legacy my grandfather had spent 40 years building. My father had suffered a minor stroke 2 weeks before that Tuesday morning. The doctors said it was stress-induced, that his blood pressure had been dangerously elevated for months. He was recovering, but he couldn't work. He certainly couldn't navigate the kind of complex financial crisis management that was needed. The board of directors, composed of 5 people, including my father, was in complete chaos. 2 members had resigned rather than be associated with what looked like an impending disaster, leaving us without a quorum for major decisions at precisely the moment we needed to make them. I was vice president of finance, a title that sounded important, but really meant I was the person who understood spreadsheets and cash flow projections. I wasn't on the executive leadership team. I didn't have decision-making authority. But I was the only person in the entire organization who fully understood the financial architecture of what was happening, how the pieces connected, where the leverage points were, what might be salvaged, and what needed to be abandoned. I spent 3 days locked in my office, building a comprehensive analysis. I didn't eat regular meals. I barely slept. I just worked, driven by the knowledge that 45 families were counting on someone to find a solution, and I was the only person capable of finding one. What I discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The core business model was actually sound. Walsh Corporation's bread and butter was B2B commercial leasing office buildings, retail spaces, industrial properties. We were good at it. We had strong tenant relationships, relatively low vacancy rates, and reliable cash flow from those operations. The problem was that we'd over-leveraged ourselves on the Phoenix development project, essentially betting the company's future on a single deal that had gone catastrophically wrong. The solution required 3 simultaneous interventions. First, I needed to restructure our existing debt. We had 7 different creditors, each with their own terms, their own legal teams, their own tolerance for risk. I spent the next 8 months negotiating with each one individually, working the phones 12 to 18 hours a day. I explained our situation with brutal honesty. We couldn't meet the current payment schedules, but we could meet extended ones. I proposed converting 3-year payment horizons to 10-year horizons, which would reduce our immediate cash pressure by 73%. Some creditors agreed readily. Others required extensive financial documentation, personal guarantees from me, in addition to my father's, and higher interest rates. But eventually, I got all 7 on board. Second, we needed bridge financing to weather the immediate crisis and fund our operations while we unwound the Phoenix disaster. I put together a detailed turnaround plan and pitched it to 12 different private equity firms and investment groups. 11 of them declined. But Silvercrest Capital, a mid-sized firm specializing in distressed asset recovery, saw potential. They agreed to provide $2.1 million in bridge financing at terms that were expensive but not predatory. That money gave us breathing room. Third, we needed to evolve our business model. I proposed pivoting from pure B2B commercial leasing to a B2B2C hybrid that included co-working spaces and mixed-use developments. The co-working trend was just beginning to explode in 2018, and we had existing properties that could be converted. This would diversify our revenue streams and make us less vulnerable to single points of failure like the Phoenix project. I built the financial models, identified the properties, and created the implementation timeline. During those 8 months, I lived and breathed Walsh Corporation's survival. I lost 15 pounds. I developed insomnia that required prescription medication. My relationship with the man I'd been dating for 2 years fell apart because I couldn't give him any attention or emotional energy. But we saved the company. By December of 2018, we were stable. By mid-2019, we were actually growing again. Sarah, during this entire period, held the title of Marketing Director. She was 34 years old and had been with the company for 6 years, in a role that was, to be generous, largely ceremonial. She attended meetings when specifically required, worked maybe 30 hours a week, and spent most of her time managing our social media presence and planning company events. While I was on the phone with creditors at midnight, Sarah was at yoga retreats. While I was building financial models that would determine whether our employees kept their jobs, Sarah was redesigning our website. But here's where I made the mistake that would eventually cost me everything I chose to work behind the scenes. I made a calculated decision to position myself as invisible to keep my name off official documentation, to conduct negotiations via phone and email rather than in person. My reasoning seemed sound at the time. If the turnaround plan failed, and there was a significant chance it would, I wanted the blame to fall on me, not on the Walsh family name. I wanted to protect my father's legacy, protect the company's reputation, in case we needed to attempt a sale or merger, protect Sarah's future career prospects. So I worked through informal channels. I had conversations that weren't recorded in official meeting minutes. I sent emails from my personal account rather than my corporate one for sensitive negotiations. I specifically asked Silvercrest Capital to keep my involvement quiet during the due diligence process. The board knew I was involved in the rescue effort, but they didn't know the extent. They thought I was supporting a team effort, not architecting the entire strategy alone. When the turnaround succeeded, there was no clear paper trail proving I was the architect. There were fragments, emails here, a memo there, conversations people remembered, but no comprehensive documentation. And Sarah, who had attended exactly 4 high-profile meetings during the entire 8-month crisis, suddenly had photographs. Pictures of her shaking hands with Silvercrest executives. Photos of her at the signing ceremony when we closed the bridge financing deal. Images of her presenting at the board meeting where we announced the business model pivot. Without me explicitly claiming credit, without me stepping forward and saying this was my work, Sarah began to fill the vacuum. She started telling people she'd led the crisis response. She gave interviews to industry publications about her role in the turnaround. And because I'd been so careful to stay invisible, because I'd worked so hard to keep my fingerprints off the official record, there was no easy way to contradict her narrative without sounding petty or jealous. I'd saved Walsh Corporation. But in choosing to be the invisible hero, in prioritizing family reputation over personal recognition, in believing that the truth would somehow speak for itself, I'd lost the one thing that mattered most, the ability to prove that the truth was mine. The consequences of that choice became devastatingly clear. 6 months later, in September of 2019, when Sarah received an invitation to speak at the National Commercial Real Estate Summit in Chicago, the conference organizers had somehow heard about Walsh Corporation's dramatic turnaround and wanted someone to present a session on crisis management. They'd sent the invitation directly to Sarah's email, apparently assuming she was the executive who'd led the rescue effort. I was sitting in my office when Sarah stopped by holding her laptop with the invitation pulled up on screen. I remember thinking she was going to ask me how to politely decline or perhaps suggest that we present together. Instead, she said, "They want me to speak at NCRES about the turnaround. It's a 45-minute keynote slot. This could be really good for my career." Not our careers. Not the company's reputation. Her career. I should have said something in that moment. I should have told her that she couldn't possibly give a presentation about work she hadn't done, that it would be dishonest that I was the person who should be speaking, if anyone was. But that lifetime of conditioning, be quiet, don't make demands, don't cause trouble, kept me silent. I said something noncommittal like, "That's an interesting opportunity," and she took my lack of protest as permission. 2 months later, I watched the live stream of her presentation from my office. Sarah stood on stage in front of 800 commercial real estate professionals, looking polished and confident in a charcoal suit, and proceeded to deliver my entire crisis management strategy as if it were her own creation. She used PowerPoint slides that I recognized immediately because I'd built the original frameworks. There was the 4-quadrant creditor assessment matrix I'd developed for prioritizing negotiation targets. There was the cash flow projection model showing our 73% pressure reduction. There was the business model evolution diagram explaining the B2B to B2B2C pivot. But it wasn't just the slides. Sarah told stories, specific detailed stories from the 8 months I'd spent saving the company. She described the late-night phone call with our most difficult creditor, the one who'd initially refused to negotiate until I spent 2 hours walking him through our financial fundamentals and convinced him we were a better bet alive than dead. She recounted the moment during the Silvercrest presentation when their CFO asked a technical question about our debt-to-equity ratio, and someone provided an answer so detailed and well-reasoned that it shifted the entire tone of the meeting. That someone had been me feeding information to our CEO through notes because I wasn't even in the room for that particular meeting. Sarah told these stories with herself as the protagonist. "I knew we had to approach each creditor individually," she said, as if she'd been the one spending 18-hour days on the phone. "I structured the bridge financing deal to give us maximum flexibility," she explained, gesturing to slides showing terms I'd spent 3 weeks negotiating. She even used specific phrases I recognized from my own internal memos, creating sustainable value through strategic patience and converting crisis into opportunity through disciplined execution. The presentation was recorded and uploaded to YouTube within 24 hours. Within a week, it had 20,000 views. Within a month, 200,000. People in the comments called Sarah brilliant innovative, a rising star in crisis management. Industry publications picked up the story. LinkedIn influencers shared clips with captions like, "This is what real leadership looks like." I sat alone in my office that evening after watching the live stream, experiencing something I'd never felt before in my 40 years of life. A white-hot rage so intense it made my hands shake. Not because Sarah had given the presentation I didn't even particularly want to give speeches or be in the spotlight, but because she'd taken the most difficult, most painful period of my professional life, the 8 months when I'd sacrificed my health and my relationships and my sanity to save our family's company, and she'd turned it into a performance piece starring herself. I confronted her the next morning in her office. I remember my voice shaking as I asked how she could possibly give that presentation without even mentioning my name, without acknowledging that I'd done the actual work. Sarah looked at me with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. I couldn't quite tell which. "Christina," she said, her tone suggesting she was explaining something obvious to a child. "You did the technical work. I'm not disputing that. But I'm the one who knows how to communicate it, how to tell the story in a way that people understand and remember. Isn't that what actually matters in business? Results are great, but if no one knows about them, did they really happen?" I stood there speechless as she continued. "Besides, you hate public speaking. You hate attention. I'm doing you a favor by taking this on. You get to stay in your comfort zone doing the analytical work you love, and I handle the public-facing part. It's a perfect division of labor." And because I was still that 8-year-old girl who'd been praised for not needing attention, because I was still the daughter who'd learned that making demands was selfish and staying quiet was virtuous, I said nothing more. I left her office and went back to my own, and I let her narrative stand unchallenged. But Sarah wasn't done. Over the following months, I started noticing a pattern in how she talked about the 2018 crisis, particularly in conversations with our parents. She'd mention it casually over family dinners or phone calls, always with little additions that subtly undermined my role while elevating her own. Those risky decisions Christina wanted to make during the restructuring, she'd say to our father, shaking her head with a knowing smile. I had to really push back to keep things on a stable path. She was referring to my proposal 3 months after we'd secured the bridge financing to borrow an additional $1 million to fund the rapid expansion of our co-working space conversions. The proposal had been financially sound. I'd run the numbers 100 different ways, and ultimately we'd implemented it and generated significant returns. But Sarah reframed it as reckless gambling, as if she'd been the responsible adult in the room restraining my dangerous impulses. Other times she'd say things like, "Thank God I was there to keep operations running smoothly while Christina was going through her difficult period." The implication, never stated directly enough to be challenged, but clear enough to poison perception, was that I'd been emotionally unstable during the crisis. That my contribution, whatever it had been, was tainted by poor judgment or psychological fragility. My parents, who'd been largely absent from day-to-day operations during the crisis due to my father's health issues, had no way to verify these claims. They began accepting Sarah's version of events as truth, their memories of that chaotic period gradually being overwritten by her confident, consistent narrative. I could see it happening in small ways. The questions they'd ask me about my current work carried a slight undertone of concern, as if they were monitoring me for signs of instability. What I didn't know at the time was that Sarah was also taking concrete steps to protect her false narrative and create leverage against any future challenge. I found out years later that in late 2019, she'd gone to our IT director with a request that seemed perfectly reasonable. She wanted to archive old project files from 2018 to clean up the server and improve system performance. The IT director, seeing nothing suspicious in the request, complied. But Sarah hadn't asked for a general archive. She'd specifically requested copies of certain documents, my email correspondence during the crisis period, early draft proposals with my name on them, meeting notes I'd written, preliminary financial models. She cherry-picked materials that, taken out of context, could be twisted to support whatever narrative she wanted to construct. An email where I'd expressed uncertainty about whether a particular creditor would negotiate could be used to suggest I'd been defeatist or lacking confidence. A draft proposal that went through 7 revisions before reaching its final form could be used to imply my initial thinking was flawed. Sarah created a digital insurance policy that day, a collection of genuine documents that told an incomplete and potentially misleading story. She filed them away in her personal drive's password-protected waiting. I had no idea this archive existed. I had no idea that the person who knew every detail of the most vulnerable period of my professional life was systematically gathering ammunition that could be used against me if I ever tried to reclaim the truth. When the person who knows all your vulnerabilities becomes your enemy, When they understand exactly where you're weak and exactly what you fear, how do you possibly defend yourself? I didn't answer that question for weeks. Instead, I did what I'd always done when faced with problems that felt too big or too messy to solve. I analyzed it to death. I spent late nights sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad creating lists that I thought would bring clarity, but instead only highlighted how trapped I was. At the top of one page, I wrote pros of staying silent, and underneath listed everything that felt safe about not rocking the boat. Family peace, such as it was, would remain intact. I wouldn't have to endure the drama of public confrontation or accusations. I wouldn't look petty or jealous, wouldn't be perceived as the bitter older sister who couldn't stand her younger sibling's success. I wouldn't risk Sarah weaponizing those archived documents against me, turning my own emails and proposals into evidence of poor judgment or instability. Most importantly, I wouldn't have to violate the role I'd spent 45 years perfecting: the easy daughter, the one who didn't cause trouble, the one who stayed quiet. On the facing page, I wrote, cons of staying silent, and the list that emerged felt like it was written in acid. Living with injustice day after day, watching someone else receive credit and opportunities that should have been mine. Enabling Sarah's behavior, teaching her that fraud had no consequences. Allowing my legacy to be completely erased, my contributions to Walsh Corporation's survival deleted from history as if they'd never happened. Betraying every employee who'd kept their job because of work I'd done, but that would forever be attributed to someone else. I stared at those two lists until 3 a.m, trying to find some configuration where I didn't lose something essential. But there wasn't one. Every path required sacrifice. The only question was, what I was willing to lose: my peace or my truth, my family or my integrity, my invisibility or my credibility. I told myself I was being strategic by not deciding immediately, that I was gathering information and considering all angles. But really, I was paralyzed by the same fear that had governed my entire life, the fear of being seen as difficult, of taking up space, of demanding that people acknowledge my existence and my value. While I sat with my indecision, life continued to provide evidence of exactly what my silence was costing me. The indignities arrived almost daily, each one small enough to ignore on its own, but accumulating into a weight that became harder to carry. A professor from Stanford Business School emailed me asking for contact information for Sarah Walsh, the architect of the Walsh Corporation turnaround. He was developing a case study on family business crisis management and wanted to interview her about her decision-making process during the 2018 restructuring. The email was polite and professional, and it felt like being stabbed with a very courteous knife. I stared at it for 20 minutes before responding with Sarah's email address, unable to bring myself to correct the record, but also unable to simply delete the message and pretend it hadn't happened. A former colleague from a previous job, someone I hadn't spoken with in 5 years, sent me a LinkedIn message. Saw your sister's presentation at NCRES. So impressive. You must be so proud of her. It's wonderful how graciously you've supported her success. The message was meant kindly, but it contained such a fundamental misunderstanding of reality that I didn't know how to respond. I typed and deleted 3 different replies before finally just closing the app. The worst moment came at a family dinner in November, almost exactly a year after Sarah's conference presentation had gone viral. We were gathered at my parents' home in Pacific Heights for my father's 74th birthday. The dining room table was set with my grandmother's china, the meal prepared by the same caterer they'd used for special occasions for 20 years. Sarah was holding court, talking about the various speaking invitations she'd received, the advisory board positions, the interview requests from business publications. When dessert was served, my father stood to make a toast. Richard Walsh was a man who'd built a successful company through discipline and strategic thinking, and even in his mid-70s with his health diminished, he commanded respect when he spoke. He raised his glass and said, "I want to thank Sarah for saving our family's legacy. 2 years ago, I didn't know if Walsh Corporation would survive. But my daughter stepped up when it mattered most, and because of her brilliance and her courage, We're not just surviving, we're thriving. To Sarah, the daughter who saved everything we've built. I was sitting 3 feet away from him. 3 feet. Close enough to see the genuine pride in his eyes, close enough to hear the emotion in his voice. And I was completely, utterly invisible. My mother raised her glass with tears in her eyes. Sarah accepted the toast with gracious humility that would have been admirable if it weren't built on a foundation of lies. I went through the motions of raising my own glass, of smiling, of murmuring congratulations. But something inside me was breaking in a way that I wasn't sure could be repaired. Each of these incidents individually was survivable, but the pattern they created was suffocating. Every day my contributions were being erased a little more completely. Every day, Sarah's false narrative became more firmly established as unquestionable truth. Every day I disappeared a little further. I began to understand that my silence hadn't protected me from anything. It had simply enabled my own destruction. The final breaking point came in January 4 months ago, when I received a letter from the National Real Estate Association. For 15 years, I'd been working toward one particular professional goal, being selected as a keynote speaker for their annual conference. The NREA conference was the most prestigious event in our industry, attended by 12,000 professionals, covered by major business media. A keynote slot at NREA wasn't just an honor, it was a career-defining moment that opened doors to board positions, consulting opportunities, and industry leadership roles. I'd submitted proposals to speak at NREA 5 different times over the years. Each time I'd been turned down with polite form letters thanking me for my interest. I'd told myself that I just needed to be patient, that my time would come, that eventually my expertise would be recognized. The letter I received in January wasn't addressed to me. It had been sent to Walsh Corporation's general admin email and forwarded to me by our office manager, who thought I'd want to see it. The NREA Selection Committee had chosen Sarah Walsh as one of 3 keynote speakers for their 2025 conference. The letter specifically cited her innovative crisis management approach demonstrated during Walsh Corporation's 2018 restructuring as the primary reason for selection. I read that letter 5 times, each reading making me feel more hollow. This wasn't just about credit anymore. This was about Sarah actively receiving opportunities that should have been mine, building a career on work she didn't do, opening doors with keys she'd stolen from my pocket. She was being invited to speak at the conference I'd been trying to crack for 15 years, being recognized for expertise she didn't possess, being celebrated for accomplishments that were mine. I made a decision that night, sitting alone in my apartment with that letter on my kitchen counter. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Not because I craved recognition or attention, I still didn't particularly want those things, but because allowing this to continue meant becoming complicit in my own erasure. It meant teaching Sarah and everyone else that truth didn't matter, that ethics were optional, that fraud had no consequences. But I also understood something crucial: one wrong move would destroy me. If I confronted Sarah impulsively, emotionally, without irrefutable evidence and careful strategy, I'd be dismissed as the jealous sister having a breakdown. The incomplete documents she'd archived could be used to support that narrative. My 45 years of silence and self-effacement meant I had no credibility as someone who spoke up for herself. If I was going to fight, I needed to be strategic. I needed to be patient. I needed to be absolutely, unquestionably right. The question that haunted me as I finally committed to action was simple but terrifying. Can someone who's been invisible for 45 years learn to fight in the light? I started looking for the answer the next morning by doing something I'd never done before. I searched for a lawyer whose job was to expose the truth rather than help me hide from it. Robert Chen's name came up within the first hour of research. He specialized in financial forensics and white-collar investigations, the kind of attorney who got hired when corporations suspected fraud or when executives needed someone to reconstruct complex financial events. What made him particularly relevant to my situation was his background. He'd spent 12 years as general counsel for Silvercrest Capital before semi-retiring at 65 to take on selective consulting work. That meant he'd been on the other side of the table during our 2018 crisis negotiations. He'd witnessed my work firsthand, even if he probably didn't remember the details 7 years later. I called his office on a Wednesday morning and explained to his assistant that I needed to discuss a matter related to corporate crisis management and potentially fraudulent misrepresentation. She scheduled me for Friday afternoon, and I spent the intervening 2 days preparing documentation, every scrap of paper I'd kept from 2018, every email I could find in my personal archives, every note I'd made during those 8 months of 18-hour days. Robert's office was in a converted warehouse in the Mission District, all exposed brick and industrial windows. He was 67 now, with silver hair and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested retirement hadn't dulled his analytical abilities one bit. When I walked in carrying 2 banker's boxes of materials, he actually smiled. "Miss Walsh," he said, "I have a feeling this is going to be more interesting than the estate planning work I've been doing lately." I didn't ask him to sue Sarah. I didn't come in demanding justice or revenge. Instead, I asked him to conduct an objective review of what actually happened during Walsh Corporation's 2018 restructuring. I told him I needed someone with no emotional investment in the outcome to tell me whether my memory of events was accurate or whether I'd somehow constructed a narrative that served my ego rather than the truth. He agreed immediately, and when I asked about his fee, he waved it off. "I'm doing this pro bono," he said. "I've spent 40 years in corporate law, and one thing I've learned is that the truth matters more than politics. Let's find out what the truth is." That first meeting lasted 4 hours. I walked Robert through the entire timeline from the moment I understood how catastrophic the Phoenix development failure was through the final creditor negotiation that closed in December 2018. I showed him my financial models, my negotiation notes, my correspondence with creditors. I explained Sarah's minimal involvement and her subsequent claims of leadership. I told him about the conference presentation about my father's toast about the NREA keynote invitation. Robert listened without interrupting, taking notes in a leather-bound journal, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific dates or dollar amounts. When I finally finished exhausted from reliving those months in compressed form, he sat back in his chair and said, "You know, most lawyers would tell you to let this go. Family disputes rarely end well in court, and proving who deserves credit for corporate strategy is notoriously difficult." My heart sank, but then he continued, "However, this isn't just about credit. If your sister has been systematically misrepresenting her role in material business decisions, that's fraud. And from what you've described, we should be able to verify your account through third-party sources." He tapped his pen against his journal. "Let me do some preliminary investigation. I still have contacts at Silvercrest, and creditor negotiations leave paper trails. Give me 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks felt like 2 years. I went to work every day, attended meetings, reviewed financial reports, and tried to act as if everything was normal while my entire body hummed with anxious energy. Robert had warned me not to do anything that might alert Sarah to the investigation, not to change my behavior in any way that might seem suspicious. When we met again, his findings were both encouraging and concerning. The encouraging part was that most of my contributions were easily verifiable. Silvercrest Capital had meticulous records of every interaction during the bridge financing negotiation, and their files clearly showed me as the primary contact. Email chains with creditors, many of which had been sent from my personal email account during late-night negotiation sessions, were still accessible through those creditors' own record-keeping systems. Strategy documents I'd created and distributed had date stamps and authorship metadata that proved I'd written them. But then came the concerning part. Robert had asked Walsh Corporation's current IT director for access to the internal email archives from 2018 as part of what he described as a routine compliance review for potential audit purposes. What he found was troubling. Key emails from that period, messages that should have been easily searchable in the corporate system, appeared to have been archived or reclassified in ways that made them difficult to locate. Some were moved from active project folders into general administrative categories. Others had been transferred to backup servers that required special access requests to retrieve. This could be innocent, Robert explained, pulling up a detailed analysis on his laptop. Companies do regular server maintenance, archive old files, reorganize data structures. But the timing is suspicious. A significant number of these reclassifications happened in late 2019, right around when your sister was building her public profile around the turnaround story. He explained that to get complete access to the backup servers and truly verify what had been archived and when we'd need to issue a formal legal request. That would require board approval or a court order, either of which would immediately alert the company and Sarah that someone was investigating the 2018 events. We're not ready for that yet, Robert said. Before we trigger any alarms, I want to build a foundation of third-party evidence that can't be disputed. Once we have that locked down, we can afford to go through official channels. I understood his reasoning, but I also felt time pressure that I couldn't quite articulate. Every day that passed was another day of Sarah building her false reputation, another opportunity for the truth to become harder to prove. So I made a decision that Robert would later tell me was my first major strategic error. I decided to accelerate the process by reaching out to witnesses myself. I thought I was being clever about it. I didn't use my Walsh Corporation email. I didn't make phone calls that could be recorded or monitored. Instead, I sent personal emails from my Gmail account to two people I considered friendly witnesses who could corroborate my role: David Park, who'd been COO of Silvercrest Capital during our 2018 negotiations and had since retired to Sonoma, and Jennifer Morrison, the lead accountant from the restructuring team who'd worked closely with me on the creditor negotiations. The email I sent was carefully worded to sound casual rather than legal. I mentioned that I was documenting the company's history and wondered if they'd be willing to have a conversation about their memories of the 2018 period. I made it sound like a research project rather than an investigation. David Park responded within a day, warmly agreeing to meet for coffee whenever I was in the area. His response gave me a surge of hope, but Jennifer Morrison's response was more cautious. She said she'd need to think about it and check with her current employer about whether participating in such a conversation would create any conflicts. That should have been my warning sign, but I was too focused on the progress to see the danger. What I didn't know was that Jennifer now worked for a financial consulting firm that had Walsh Corporation as a client. What I didn't consider was that checking with her employer meant mentioning to her managing partner that Christina Walsh had reached out asking questions about the 2018 restructuring. What I completely failed to anticipate was that her managing partner played golf every Saturday with William Chen, one of Walsh Corporation's board members, and that casual golf course conversation includes plenty of business gossip. 72 hours after I sent those emails, Sarah knew I was asking questions. And I had just given my enemy advance warning that I was preparing to attack. I didn't realize my mistake until it was far too late to correct it. The first sign that something had gone wrong came on Monday morning, 4 days after I'd sent those emails to David Park and Jennifer Morrison. I was reviewing quarterly projections in my office when my assistant knocked and said my mother was on the line, which was unusual. Eleanor Walsh didn't typically call me at work unless something was seriously wrong. "Christina," she said without preamble, her voice tight with concern. "William Chen called your father this morning. He said there are rumors you've been contacting people outside the company asking strange questions about 2018. What's going on?" My stomach dropped. William Chen was on our board of directors, a venture capitalist who'd been friends with my father for 20 years. There was no reason he should know about my witness outreach unless someone had told him, which meant the information had traveled through channels I hadn't anticipated. I tried to explain that I was simply documenting company history, but my mother cut me off. "Your father is very upset. He thinks you're trying to cause problems for Sarah just when her career is taking off. Please tell me that's not what this is about." After I hung up, I sat staring at my computer screen, trying to trace how the information could have leaked so quickly. Then I remembered Jennifer Morrison's cautious response, her mention of checking with her employer. I did a quick search and discovered something I should have verified before reaching out. Her firm, Morrison Financial Consulting, listed Walsh Corporation as a client on their website. Of course she'd mentioned my inquiry to her bosses. Of course one of them would know someone on our board. The business world in San Francisco wasn't just small, it was incestuously interconnected. I called Robert Chen immediately. "We have a problem," I said, and explained what had happened. There was a long pause before he responded. "That's unfortunate, but not necessarily fatal. Let me reach out to my contacts and see what the damage is." The damage, it turned out, was catastrophic. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that Sarah had always been better at corporate politics than I'd given her credit for. While I'd been focused on spreadsheets and strategy, she'd been building a network of allies and information sources that would make an intelligence agency envious. She had the IT administrator who'd helped her archive those 2018 documents. She had William Chen, who considered her a protégé after she'd charmed him at various company events. She even had a junior associate at a mid-sized law firm who occasionally fed her information about potential legal issues affecting Walsh Corporation, part of her effort to stay ahead of any threats to the company or her position within it. When William Chen mentioned my witness outreach during a casual phone call with Sarah, ostensibly to ask if she knew what her sister was up to, Sarah didn't panic. She thanked him for the heads-up, hung up, and immediately called her own attorney, a woman named Patricia Vance who specialized in reputation management and corporate defense. Sarah didn't hire Patricia to defend against my accusations. She hired her to make sure my accusations never gained credibility in the first place. The strategy Patricia recommended was devastatingly simple: control the narrative before Christina could even articulate one. On Wednesday morning, 3 days after my mother's phone call, a story appeared on Commercial Real Estate Insider, an industry blog that had 50,000 subscribers and was widely read by everyone who mattered in our field. The headline was deliberately vague: "Trouble in Paradise, Family Drama Brewing at Prominent SF Real Estate Firm." And the story was written as a blind item, the kind of gossip that never names names but provides enough identifying details that insiders can easily connect the dots. It read, "Sources close to a prominent San Francisco commercial real estate company report internal family tensions related to the firm's widely celebrated 2018 turnaround. A family member who played a supporting role during the crisis has reportedly been contacting former business associates, attempting to revise the historical record and inflate their own involvement in the company's rescue. Industry insiders suggest the behavior may stem from sibling rivalry and resentment toward a younger family member whose crisis management expertise has received national recognition." The story continued. While family dynamics in closely held businesses are common sources, express concern that the individual's attempts to rewrite history could damage the company's reputation and relationships with key partners. Several former associates contacted by the family member have declined to participate in what they describe as a problematic effort to undermine someone else's legitimate accomplishments. I read the story 3 times, each time feeling more sick. The piece never mentioned my name, or Sarah's never said Walsh Corporation explicitly. But anyone in our industry would immediately know who it was about. Sarah had just been featured in Forbes. Our 2018 turnaround was well documented. The NREA had just announced her as a keynote speaker. More devastating than the story itself was how it framed the situation. I wasn't the person trying to reclaim credit for work I'd actually done. I was the jealous older sibling, the bitter family member trying to steal someone else's accomplishments, the person engaging in problematic behavior driven by rivalry and resentment. Before I'd even had a chance to present evidence or make my case, Sarah had turned me into the villain of the story. The consequences cascaded quickly. By Thursday afternoon, 2 more board members had called my father expressing concern. I received a formal email from David Park, the Silvercrest Capital executive, who'd initially agreed to meet with me, withdrawing his offer. "Upon reflection," he wrote, "I don't feel comfortable getting involved in what appears to be a family dispute. I'm sure you understand." Jennifer Morrison sent a similar message, more apologetic but equally final. "Christina, I wish you well, but I can't participate in what's starting to look like family drama. I hope you and your sister can work things out privately." Both of them specifically used the phrase family drama, which told me they'd read the commercial real estate insider piece or had heard about it through the industry grapevine. My potential witnesses had been neutralized before I'd even formulated what I needed them to testify to. Robert Chen called me Friday evening. I could hear the frustration in his voice. "Sarah just executed a nearly perfect preemptive strike," he said bluntly. "She's controlled the narrative before you even had a chance to speak. Now, if you come forward with your evidence, even though it's solid evidence, the industry is primed to see you as exactly what she's described, a bitter sister trying to steal credit." "So, what do I do?" I asked, hearing the defeat in my own voice. "We regroup," Robert said. "We wait. We build an airtight case and we find a way to present it that doesn't confirm the narrative she's created. But Christina, I need you to understand something. You've lost the element of surprise. You've lost the benefit of the doubt. Sarah knows you're coming for her now, which means she'll be prepared for whatever move you make next." I sat in my apartment that night looking out at the San Francisco skyline, trying to understand how I'd been so thoroughly outmaneuvered. I'd thought I was being strategic by reaching out to witnesses. I'd thought I was building a case. Instead, I'd telegraphed my intentions to my opponent and given her time to set up defenses I hadn't even imagined. Sarah had always been underestimated, including by me. While I'd dismissed her as someone who cared more about appearances than substance, she'd been building a sophisticated network of allies and information sources. While I'd assumed she was just lucky or opportunistic, she'd been strategic and calculating. And while I'd been trying to gather evidence to prove what really happened in 2018, she'd been making sure that even if I proved it, no one would believe me. The realization was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. I wasn't fighting someone who'd stumbled into fraud and was now scrambling to cover it up. I was fighting someone who'd planned this carefully, who'd anticipated resistance, and who'd prepared contingencies for exactly this scenario. When your enemy controls the narrative before you even speak, when they've already written the story and cast you as the villain, how do you possibly reclaim the truth? The answer came in the form of a phone call from my father on Sunday afternoon, 5 days after the commercial real estate insider story had detonated across the industry. His voice was formal, the tone he used for business matters rather than family conversations. "Your mother and I would like you to come to the house next Saturday. We need to have a family discussion about some concerns that have come up." I knew immediately what this was. Not an invitation, but a summons. Not a discussion, but a judgment that had already been rendered. The drive to my parents' Napa Valley estate took 90 minutes, and I spent every mile of it rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd defend myself, how I'd make them understand that Sarah was the one lying, not me. By the time I pulled through the iron gates and up the long driveway lined with olive trees, I'd convinced myself that I could make them listen, that reason and truth would prevail if I just presented my case clearly enough. I should have known better. Sarah's car was already parked in the circular driveway when I arrived. Of course, she was already there. This wasn't going to be a conversation, it was an ambush, and Sarah had been given time to set the stage before I entered. My parents were waiting in the library, a room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and the kind of heavy leather furniture that suggested serious conversations. My father sat in his usual chair near the fireplace, looking older than his 74 years, the effects of his stroke 2 years ago still visible in the slight droop of his left side. My mother perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged in an expression of concerned disappointment that I recognized from childhood whenever I'd failed to meet some unspoken expectation. Sarah sat in the chair across from them, and when I walked in, she looked up with red-rimmed eyes as if she'd been crying. She didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge me beyond a small hurt nod. It was a masterful performance, the wounded younger sister confused and hurt by her older sister's inexplicable behavior. My father gestured for me to sit in the remaining chair, and I felt like I was facing a tribunal. "Christina," he began, and the formality in his voice made my chest tighten. "We've been hearing some very troubling things. Several board members have contacted me with concerns about your recent behavior. William Chen said you've been reaching out to former business associates asking questions about the 2018 restructuring. I started to explain that I was simply trying to document what actually happened, but my mother interrupted. We read that story in Commercial Real Estate Insider. It didn't name names, but it was obviously about our family. Christina, is it true? Are you trying to change the story of what happened during the crisis? I'm not trying to change the story, I said, working to keep my voice steady. I'm trying to tll the truth. Sarah has been claiming credit for work I did for a turnaround I architected. I saved Walsh Corporation, and she's built her entire career on pretending she did it. The words came out more forcefully than I'd intended, and I saw my father's jaw tighten. Sarah, still saying nothing, put her hand over her mouth as if holding back a sob. Sarah explained to us how hard she worked during that period. My father said, his tone suggesting he was dealing with a difficult child rather than his 45-year-old daughter. She told us about the negotiations with Silvercrest, about managing the creditor relationships, about developing the new business strategy. And now you're contacting people from that time trying to take credit for her accomplishments. Every word I'd prepared, every careful explanation died in my throat. They'd already decided what the truth was, and nothing I said would change it. Sarah had gotten to them first, had told her version of events, and my parents, who hadn't been involved in the day-to-day crisis management, who'd been dealing with my father's health issues, had no way to verify her claims beyond taking her word for it. I tried anyway. I explained about the 18-hour days, about the individual creditor negotiations I'd led, about the Silvercrest presentation I'd built. But every statement sounded defensive. Every fact felt like an excuse. And Sarah, sitting across from me, never said a single aggressive word. She just looked hurt and confused, occasionally wiping her eyes, the perfect picture of a younger sister being attacked for no reason she could understand. Finally, my mother delivered the blow that made me understand how completely I'd lost this battle. Christina, she said, her voice gentle but laced with pity. You've always been so independent, so self-sufficient. You've never needed much from us, never asked for help or attention. We're worried that maybe you're lonely. Maybe you're seeking attention in ways that aren't healthy. The implication was clear. I wasn't telling the truth. I was having some kind of psychological crisis, manufacturing grievances to get attention I'd never learned to ask for appropriately. They'd taken my lifetime of quiet competence and reframed it as evidence of dysfunction. I left that meeting understanding that I'd lost my family's support completely. Whatever happened next, I'd be fighting alone. Sarah found me in the driveway as I was about to get in my car. Christina, wait, she said, her voice low enough that our parents couldn't hear from inside. The tears were gone now, replaced by a calm calculation that was much more familiar. I think for the good of the family, you should take a leave of absence from the company. 3 months fully paid. A chance to rest and refocus. It wasn't a suggestion. The way she said it made that clear. And if I don't? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Then I'll have to share some documents with the board. Emails from 2018 where you proposed some very risky financial strategies, like that plan to borrow an additional $1 million right after we'd nearly gone bankrupt. I'm sure your intentions were good, but taken out of context, these decisions might raise questions about your judgment. And given the concerns that have already been raised about your recent behavior, she didn't need to finish. I understood the threat perfectly. She had those archived documents, those fragments of my work that she could twist to support whatever narrative she wanted. And in my current position, already labeled as unstable, already dismissed as the jealous sister defending myself, would only make things worse. I agreed to the leave of absence. What choice did I have? But during those 3 months away from Walsh Corporation, I did something Sarah didn't expect. I didn't become erratic or desperate. I didn't spiral into the breakdown she'd suggested was coming. Instead, I became methodical. I spent days reconstructing timelines from 2018, writing down every conversation I could remember, every decision I'd made, every negotiation I'd led. I pulled financial records from my personal files, emails from my private accounts, notes I'd kept in physical notebooks. I built a comprehensive documentation of what had actually happened, organizing it chronologically with supporting evidence for each claim. I met with Robert Chen weekly, and I told him something I should have said from the beginning. I moved too fast and got burned. I won't make that mistake again. Let's build an airtight case slowly and quietly. No more witness outreach, no more premature moves. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. Robert agreed, and together we developed a strategy that would take months to execute, but would be unassailable when we finally moved. I also did something else during that forced leave. I studied Sarah. Really studied her for the first time in my life. I watched every conference presentation she'd ever given on YouTube. I read every interview she'd done with business publications. I analyzed her communication patterns, her rhetorical strategies, the way she framed narratives and positioned herself within them. What I discovered was disturbing. Sarah wasn't just an opportunist who'd seized a lucky break. She was executing a long-term plan with remarkable precision. Every speech built on the previous one, each interview adding details that made her story more concrete and harder to refute. She was creating what amounted to a constructed reality, and she was doing it with the skill of someone who'd been planning this for years. To beat her, I realized I'd need to be just as calculated, just as patient, just as strategic. In a war where patience is a weapon, who will strike at the perfect moment? The answer began to reveal itself 2 months into my forced leave when Robert Chen called me at 8 a.m. with an urgency in his voice I hadn't heard before. "We need to meet today. Maria found something." Maria Rodriguez was the forensic IT specialist Robert had brought onto the case, a woman in her 50s who'd spent 20 years doing digital forensics for corporate litigation. She'd been working on gaining access to Walsh Corporation's backup servers, a process that required a formal request to the board. Robert had framed it as routine compliance work, ensuring data integrity for potential audit purposes. And the board, not suspecting anything connected to family drama, had approved the access without much discussion. I met them at Robert's office that afternoon. Maria had her laptop connected to a large monitor, and even before she spoke, I could see from her expression that whatever she'd found was significant. "I've been examining the metadata on documents from the 2018 restructuring period." She began pulling up a spreadsheet that meant nothing to me until she started explaining. Metadata is like a digital fingerprint. It tells you when a file was created, who created it, when it was last modified, who modified it, what device was used. It's very difficult to alter without leaving traces. She clicked through to show me a list of 12 files. I recognized most of them immediately. The 4-quadrant creditor assessment matrix I'd developed, the cash flow projection model, the Silvercrest presentation deck, several key strategy memos, email threads with creditors. These were core documents from the crisis period, the foundation of everything we'd done to save the company. "Here's what's interesting," Maria continued. "All 12 of these files show signs of modification on the same date, March 15, 2021. The modifications happened at 11:47 p.m. from a laptop registered to Sarah Walsh, logged in under her credentials, connecting from an IP address that matches her home network in Russian Hill." My heart was pounding, but I wasn't sure yet what this meant. "What kind of modifications?" "Subtle ones," Maria said, pulling up a detailed analysis. "Not the kind of obvious changes that would trigger alerts. Altered timestamps that made certain documents appear to have been created or edited by Sarah rather than you. Changed authorship fields in the file properties. Small edits to meeting notes, changing phrases like Christina proposed to Sarah proposed, or Christina led the negotiation to the team led the negotiation. In the email threads, she modified the sender and recipient fields in the metadata, making it appear that she'd been more central to communications than she actually was. Robert leaned forward. "This isn't routine document management, Christina. This is systematic falsification. Your sister went back into historical records 3 years after the fact and altered them to support her narrative. If anyone ever questioned her version of events like you're doing now, the company's own archives would appear to corroborate her story rather than yours. I felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath me. This wasn't opportunism. This wasn't Sarah seeing a chance to claim credit and impulsively taking it. This was premeditated, calculated fraud. March 15th, 2021. I said quietly, my mind catching on that date. It felt significant somehow, but I couldn't immediately place why. Then I remembered. I pulled out my phone and opened my calendar app, scrolling back to 2021. There it was. March 15th, 2021 was my 42nd birthday. The memory came flooding back with nauseating clarity. Sarah had shown up at my apartment that evening around 7, carrying a beautifully wrapped package and a bottle of expensive wine. The gift was a first-edition copy of Peter Drucker's The Effective Executive, a book I'd mentioned wanting during a conversation months earlier. I'd been touched that she remembered that she'd put thought into finding something meaningful rather than just buying a generic gift. We'd sat on my couch for 3 hours that night drinking wine and talking. I remembered the conversation clearly because it had felt like one of the rare moments of genuine connection with my sister. She'd asked me about my career, about whether I felt fulfilled at Walsh Corporation, about my hopes for the future. She'd seemed vulnerable, asking for advice about her own professional development, wondering if she was on the right path. I'd gone to bed that night feeling closer to Sarah than I had in years, grateful for a sister who cared enough to spend my birthday with me when she could have been out with her own friends. And just 4 hours before she'd arrived at my apartment with that thoughtful gift and that warm smile, she'd been sitting at her laptop, systematically altering corporate documents to erase my contributions from history. I looked up at Robert and Maria, and I must have looked as sick as I felt because Robert immediately pushed a glass of water toward me. "What is it?" "That was my birthday," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. March 15th, 2021. Sarah came to my apartment that evening. She brought me a gift, a first-edition book I'd mentioned wanting. We drank wine and talked for hours. She asked me for career advice. I couldn't finish the sentence. She'd seemed loving. She'd seemed like the sister I'd always wished I had. The betrayal wasn't just professional anymore. It was profoundly, devastatingly personal. Sarah hadn't just stolen credit for my work, she'd done it while maintaining a facade of affection, while pretending to care about me, while accepting my advice and my time and my trust. She could smile in my face, drink wine in my home, ask me intimate questions about my hopes and dreams, all while knowing that hours earlier she'd been stabbing me in the back with methodical precision. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, I said more to myself than to Robert and Maria. This was planned, calculated. Robert nodded grimly. It's worse than that. Maria and I have been piecing together the timeline. The document alterations in March 2021 weren't Sarah's first move. They were her insurance policy. He pulled up a timeline on his laptop. She started building her false narrative in September 2019 with that conference presentation where she claimed your work as her own. Then she systematically strengthened the story through interviews, speaking engagements, networking. Each appearance built on the previous one, adding details, making the narrative more concrete. Maria added, by early 2021, her story was becoming established truth. She'd been featured in Forbes, she was speaking at major conferences, she had board members and industry leaders believing her version of events. That's when she went back and altered the digital records. She was covering her tracks retroactively, Robert explained, building a documentary foundation under a narrative she'd already constructed. That way, if anyone ever challenged her like you're doing now, the company's own archives would seem to support her. It's sophisticated, Christina. This is the work of someone who thought several moves ahead. I sat there trying to reconcile this methodical, calculating person with the sister I thought I knew. How long had Sarah been capable of this level of deception? Had she always been this way, and I'd just been too naive or too self-absorbed to see it? Or had something transformed her, turned her into someone capable of such elaborate fraud? Is this criminal? I asked. Can we prosecute her for this? Maria glanced at Robert, who answered carefully. Altering corporate documents is potentially criminal. Yes. It could fall under fraud, falsification of business records, possibly other charges depending on how aggressive a prosecutor wanted to be. But criminal cases are difficult and unpredictable. What we have here is definitely grounds for civil action and corporate consequences. I thought about that for a long moment. Criminal prosecution meant police courts' public scandal. It meant destroying Sarah completely, turning this family conflict into a legal nightmare that would consume years of everyone's lives. But the alternative was letting her get away with premeditated fraud, with a betrayal so calculated and complete that it had taken 3 years to fully execute. When you discover the person you thought you knew is actually a stranger capable of calculated evil, do you fight or flee? I chose to fight, but this time I wouldn't make the mistake of fighting openly. My 3-month leave of absence ended on a Tuesday in early June. I returned to Walsh Corporation with a strategy Robert and I had spent weeks refining: complete surrender, at least on the surface. The forensic evidence Maria had uncovered would remain our secret weapon, carefully guarded until the moment we chose to deploy it. In the meantime, I would become exactly what everyone already believed I was, the gracious older sister who'd finally accepted her proper place in the family hierarchy. The first test came that Friday evening at a family dinner my mother had organized ostensibly to welcome me back from my leave. I arrived at my parents' home with a bottle of their favorite wine and the most genuine smile I could manufacture. Sarah was already there, and I saw the wariness in her eyes when I walked in. She was waiting for me to cause a scene, to make accusations, to continue the conflict that had led to my forced absence. Instead, I hugged her. "I'm glad we can all be together," I said, and I felt her body stiffen with surprise before she carefully returned the embrace. Over dinner, I waited for the right moment. My father was talking about some recent development project Walsh Corporation had acquired, and Sarah was offering her perspective on the marketing approach. When there was a natural pause in the conversation, I set down my fork and took a breath that I'd practiced a dozen times in front of my bathroom mirror. "I need to say something." I began looking at each of them in turn. I've done a lot of thinking these past 3 months. I was hurt that I wasn't recognized for my contributions during the 2018 crisis, and I let that hurt drive me to behavior I'm not proud of. I contacted people inappropriately, I caused division in the family, and I made things difficult for Sarah at a time when her career is really taking off. I saw my mother's eyes begin to water. My father leaned forward slightly, listening intently. "The truth is," I continued, and this part required me to swallow my pride so completely I nearly choked on it. "Sarah is right about something important. She's the one who knows how to communicate our company's success to the world, and that's a real talent I don't have. I'm good with spreadsheets and strategy, but she's good with people. That matters just as much, maybe more." I turned to Sarah directly. "I'm sorry for trying to diminish what you've accomplished. I'm sorry for causing problems." The apology was carefully calibrated, genuine enough to be believable, but not so abject that it seemed suspicious. I acknowledged hurt feelings without conceding the fundamental facts, admitted to causing division, without admitting to lying. Sarah sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable. She was trying to determine if this was real or some kind of trap. But my father made the decision for her. He actually had tears in his eyes when he said, "This is the daughter I raised. Gracious and mature. Thank you, Christina. This means more to me than you know." My mother reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "I'm so glad you found peace with this." Sarah, seeing our parents' reaction, seemed to decide that accepting my surrender was the safe play. "Thank you for saying that," she said carefully. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." Over the next few weeks, I played my role perfectly. When Sarah mentioned she was preparing for her National Real Estate Association keynote speech, I volunteered to review her presentation and offer feedback. When she asked my opinion on some financial projections for a new project, I provided detailed analysis without any hint of resentment. I attended a board meeting where she presented her proposal for a crisis management fellowship program using my methodologies, teaching my frameworks, and I smiled and nodded approvingly when others praised the idea. Sarah's initial suspicion gradually transformed into something more dangerous: overconfidence. I heard about it secondhand from Tom Harrison Walsh Corporation's CFO, who mentioned casually that he'd been at lunch near Sarah's table at Boulevard last week. "She was with some friends from business school," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I overheard her say something about how you'd finally accepted that she was better suited for leadership roles. It seemed, I don't know, graceless." What Tom was too diplomatic to say directly was that Sarah had become brazen in her certainty of victory. She stopped being careful about her claims. At a board meeting I attended, she described the 2018 Silvercrest negotiations, with details that grew more elaborate each time she told the story, positioning herself as the sole architect of terms she'd had nothing to do with. She started floating the idea of writing a book about crisis management, even mentioning a potential title, "The Walsh Method Leading Through Chaos." The book proposal was particularly galling because it would enshrine her lies in permanent form, creating a reference work that business students might read for decades. But I said nothing. I smiled and told her it sounded like a wonderful idea. Sarah's guard was completely down now. She believed she'd won so decisively that I no longer posed any threat, and that was exactly where I needed her. While maintaining my facade of cooperation, I was doing something else entirely. I was quietly rebuilding relationships with people inside Walsh Corporation who'd witnessed the 2018 crisis firsthand and knew the truth even if they'd never spoken it aloud. I had lunch with Tom Harrison at a quiet restaurant in North Beach, and I didn't ask him to do anything or say anything. I just listened as he talked about his discomfort with how the story of the turnaround had been told. "I was in those meetings, Christina," he said, finally looking directly at me. "I know who did the work. It bothers me that the record doesn't reflect reality." I simply nodded and thanked him for his honesty. I reconnected with Elena Rodriguez, who'd been our executive assistant for 20 years before retiring last year. Elena had scheduled every single meeting during the crisis period. She knew who attended what, who led which discussions, who was actually present for the critical decisions. Over coffee, she told me, "I've thought about saying something so many times, but it's not my place and I didn't want to cause family problems." I assured her I understood, then asked if she still had her old calendars and meeting schedules. She did. I even reached out to Marcus, my estate manager, who'd been with our family for 30 years. Marcus had witnessed countless family dinners and conversations, had seen the dynamics between Sarah and me evolve over decades. When I asked him if he remembered much about the period when I was working on the company crisis, he gave me a long, measured look. "I remember you working until 2 a.m. most nights for months," he said quietly. "I remember bringing you coffee in your home office because you were too busy to stop for meals. I remember, madam." I wasn't asking any of these people to be my allies yet. I was simply reminding them of what they'd witnessed, planting seeds that might bloom when the time came for truth to be spoken aloud. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who appears to have surrendered. I set the trap 6 weeks after my return from leave on a Tuesday afternoon when I knew Sarah would be in a particularly good mood. She'd just gotten confirmation that morning that her NREA keynote speech had been selected as the conference's closing address, the most prestigious slot reserved for the speaker, who would send 12,000 real estate professionals home with inspiration and actionable insights. She'd texted me the news with 3 exclamation points. I knocked on her office door around 3 o'clock. "Hey, do you have a few minutes? I want to run an idea by you." Sarah looked up from her laptop, still radiating satisfaction. "Of course. Come in." I sat in one of the chairs across from her desk, holding a folder I'd prepared carefully. "I've been thinking about something. After everything that happened earlier this year, the misunderstandings, the tension, I think it would be smart for us to formalize our roles in the company. Create clear documentation about responsibilities, contributions, equity stakes. That way there's never any confusion or conflict in the future." Sarah's expression shifted to interest. "What did you have in mind?" "A family accord," I said, using the term Robert and I had crafted specifically because it sounded collaborative rather than adversarial. a legal document that clearly defines each family member's contributions to key company events, especially the 2018 crisis, and establishes our current roles and future expectations. It would protect both of us. Your achievements would be on record officially, and I'd have clarity about my position too. I could see her processing this, looking for the angle, trying to determine if there was some hidden threat. But the beauty of the proposal was that it gave her exactly what she wanted: official legal confirmation of the narrative she'd spent years constructing. "It seems like a good idea," she said slowly. "Who would draft it?" "I was thinking we could each have our own attorney review it, make sure we're both comfortable with the language. I can have mine prepare a first draft if you want, or you can have yours do it. Whatever makes you more comfortable." The offer to let her attorney draft it was strategic. It made me seem open and non-threatening. But Sarah, in her overconfidence, took a different path. "If your attorney drafts it, I'm fine with that," she said. "As long as I can review it before signing, of course." "Of course," I agreed. "I'll have something for you to look at next week." Robert Chen spent 3 days crafting the family accord. It was 15 pages of dense legal language formatted to look like every other corporate governance document, lots of whereas and therefore, and party of the first part, constructions, that made eyes glaze over. Most of it was genuinely standard definitions of roles, equity allocations, governance, procedures, dispute resolution, mechanisms. But Section 7.3, buried on page 12, contained language Robert had drafted with surgical precision. Each party affirms that all corporate records, communications, and documentation related to the 2018 restructuring period are accurate, unaltered, and represent true and complete accounts of events as they occurred. Both parties acknowledge they have reviewed all relevant historical records and confirm their integrity. To someone reading quickly, or to someone who didn't understand what they'd done 3 years ago, this looked like standard boilerplate. Of course, corporate records should be accurate. Of course, historical documentation should be unaltered. It seemed like the kind of clause lawyers inserted to cover all bases. But Robert had crafted it with exquisite care. By signing this document under oath with a notary present, Sarah would be making a sworn statement that Walsh Corporation's records from 2018 were unaltered. When we later produced Maria's forensic evidence proving that Sarah had modified 12 key documents in March 2021, Sarah wouldn't just be exposed as a liar, she would have committed perjury, a criminal offense that carried significant penalties. The beauty of the trap was its simplicity. Sarah had 2 choices: refuse to sign the accord, which would raise questions about why she wouldn't affirm the accuracy of corporate records, or sign it and unknowingly create legal evidence of her fraud. I sent the draft to Sarah on a Monday morning. She called me that afternoon. "I've looked through this. Seems straightforward. Do you want to sign it this week?" My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice casual. "Sure. We'll need a notary present to make it official. How's Thursday?" "Thursday works." She hadn't had a lawyer review it. She'd barely read it herself. Her overconfidence had made her careless. Thursday afternoon, we met at a law office in the financial district. Robert had arranged for a notary public to be present, a stern woman in her 60s who took her responsibilities seriously. The office was small and professional, with the kind of generic corporate art on the walls that you'd find in 1,000 similar spaces. Sarah arrived exactly on time, dressed in a charcoal suit, carrying her Hermes bag. She was in a good mood, chatting about the upcoming NREA conference as we waited for the notary to prepare the documents. I made appropriate responses, smiled at the right moments, and fought to keep my hands from trembling. The notary laid out 2 copies of the family accord on the conference table. "I'll need to see identification from both of you," she said, "and I need to confirm you're both signing this document voluntarily, that you understand its contents, and that you're doing so under oath." Sarah pulled out her driver's license without hesitation. "Understood." The notary went through the formal process, asking us each to confirm we'd read the document, that we understood we were making sworn statements that we were signing of our own free will. Sarah answered each question with easy confidence. When it came time to actually sign, Sarah picked up the pen and wrote her name across the signature line with a flourish, the kind of confident stroke you see from someone who signs important documents regularly. She didn't pause, didn't hesitate, didn't show any sign of concern. "There," she said, setting down the pen and looking at me with something that might have been triumph or might have been relief. "Now it's official, I saved the company." She'd meant it as a joke, but the statement hung in the air between us, recorded in the notary's presence, spoken by someone who'd just sworn under oath that all historical records were accurate and unaltered. I signed my own name calmly, my hand steady. The notary applied her seal to both copies, recorded the transaction in her log, and handed us each a signed original. As we left the office and walked toward the elevators, Sarah was almost giddy. "We should celebrate," she said. "Want to grab lunch? There's that new place on Market Street everyone's talking about." "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I have another appointment in 20 minutes. Rain check." "Sure," Sarah agreed easily. We parted ways on the sidewalk outside Sarah heading toward her car with the signed family accord in her bag, me walking in the opposite direction toward where Robert was waiting in a coffee shop 3 blocks away. I slid into the seat across from him and placed my copy of the document on the table between us. "She signed it," I said quietly. "She barely read it. She signed it." Robert looked at the notarized document and allowed himself a small smile. "Then the trap is set. All we need now is the right moment to spring it." What happens when you willingly sign your own confession? I found out later that the call from Sarah's personal attorney came exactly 7 days after she'd signed the family accord. Apparently, Patricia Vance had been out of the country on another case during the week Sarah was reviewing the document, and when she returned, she'd asked to see what Sarah had signed. It was meant to be routine. Patricia reviewed all of Sarah's significant legal documents as a matter of standard practice. I wasn't there for the phone call, but Robert's contacts allowed us to piece together what happened. Patricia had read through the family accord once, then immediately gone back to Section 7.3. She'd called Sarah within the hour, her voice tight with alarm. "Did you actually read this clause, Section 7.3, page 12? Sarah, from what I heard, had been dismissive at first. "It's just standard language about corporate records being accurate. Boilerplate." "Sarah, this isn't boilerplate. You've sworn under oath that all corporate records from 2018 are accurate and unaltered. If anyone can prove those documents were modified after the fact, you've just committed perjury. That's not a civil matter, that's a felony. You could face criminal charges." The silence on Sarah's end of that call apparently lasted a full 10 seconds. Then, "But no one can prove that. The documents are fine." Patricia's response was immediate. "Are you absolutely certain? Because if you modified anything, even minor edits, even metadata, it can be detected. Digital forensics can find alterations years after they're made." That's when Sarah's world started to crack. She hired her own forensics expert within 24 hours, a man named David Klein who'd done corporate IT security for 15 years. She paid him extra to work over the weekend to access Walsh Corporation's servers remotely and examine the 2018 documents. When his preliminary report came back Monday afternoon, Sarah finally understood that I'd outmaneuvered her. Klein's findings were unambiguous. 12 key documents showed clear evidence of modification in March 2021, all traced to Sarah's laptop, all with her login credentials. The alterations were subtle but detectable, exactly the kind of thing that would survive routine IT maintenance, but wouldn't stand up to forensic examination. And Sarah had just signed a legal document under oath, affirming that these records were unaltered. For the first time in years, I learned later, Sarah felt genuine fear. But Sarah hadn't built her career on fraud by giving up when cornered. If anything, desperation made her more dangerous. She spent 2 days consulting with Patricia, and together they developed what Patricia apparently called the nuclear option, a strategy so aggressive and so potentially devastating that it made everything Sarah had done before seem almost quaint by comparison. On Wednesday afternoon, Sarah scheduled an emergency meeting with 3 board members, William Chen, Margaret Foster, and James Liu, plus our parents. The meeting was held at our parents' home in Pacific Heights in the same library where they'd confronted me months earlier about my problematic behavior. I only learned about the meeting 2 days later when the formal letter arrived. But I heard from Tom Harrison what Sarah had said, how she'd positioned her attack. She'd arrived looking troubled, almost fragile. She'd thanked everyone for making time on short notice, then said she needed to raise a very difficult concern about me. According to Tom, who'd heard about it from Margaret Foster, Sarah had actual tears in her eyes as she spoke. "I'm worried about Christina's mental health," she'd said, her voice breaking slightly. "I've been noticing things for months now. The withdrawn behavior, the obsessive focus on rewriting what happened in 2018, these paranoid claims about documents being altered. And then there was that strange period where she was reaching out to former colleagues asking bizarre questions, followed by the leave of absence she had to take. She'd produced a timeline she'd prepared documenting what she called my erratic behavior. The witness outreach that had seemed inappropriate, the forced leave, the sudden apology that had seemed almost manic in its completeness, and then this strange legal document I'd insisted we both sign. "I think Christina might be experiencing some kind of breakdown," Sarah had said, wiping her eyes. "I love my sister, but I'm genuinely concerned she needs help. Professional help." The implication was clear without being stated directly. I was mentally unstable, possibly delusional, and my claims about Sarah's fraud were symptoms of psychological crisis rather than statements of fact. Margaret Foster, who'd apparently been moved by Sarah's performance, had asked what Sarah thought should be done. The answer delivered with perfect reluctance was that perhaps the board should request that I undergo an independent psychiatric evaluation before continuing in any company role. Not as punishment, Sarah had emphasized, but for my own well-being and the company's stability. The letter arrived via courier on Friday afternoon. It was written on Walsh Corporation letterhead, signed by all 5 board members, formatted in careful legal language designed to sound concerned rather than accusatory. "Dear Christina, the board of directors has received information suggesting possible concerns regarding your current well-being. Out of care for you as a valued member of our organization and our family, we respectfully request that you undergo an independent fitness for duty evaluation with Dr. Harold Brennan, a psychiatrist with extensive experience in executive mental health. This is not punitive, but precautionary, designed to ensure your well-being and the company's stability during this period of transition." I sat alone in my apartment that Friday evening, staring at the letter. And for the first time since this entire battle began, I felt something close to despair. Sarah's trap was brilliant and vicious. If I refused the evaluation, I'd appear to be hiding something confirming the narrative that I was unstable. If I submitted to it, I'd be evaluated by a psychiatrist chosen by a board. Sarah had influenced someone who could interpret any normal stress or anxiety as evidence of deeper instability. And once I was labeled as mentally unwell, every piece of evidence I presented about the document fraud could be dismissed as the delusions of someone in crisis. She wasn't just attacking my reputation anymore. She was attacking my grip on reality itself, trying to make everyone question whether I could trust my own perceptions. When your enemy is willing to destroy your sanity and credibility to win, how do you possibly prove you're the sane one? I spent that entire weekend alone in my apartment. The psychiatric evaluation letter sitting on my kitchen counter like a piece of evidence in my own trial. I couldn't sleep Friday night, couldn't eat Saturday morning. By Saturday afternoon, I'd started pulling out old photo albums I hadn't looked at in years, searching for something I couldn't quite name. Maybe proof that the sister who was trying to destroy me had once been someone different, someone I'd actually known. At 2:00 Sunday morning, unable to sleep for the 3rd night in a row, I found what I was looking for. A photo from the summer of 2000, 25 years ago. Sarah was 16, standing in the garden of our childhood home in Pacific Heights, holding up her acceptance letter from Parsons School of Design. Her smile was radiant, unguarded, genuine, in a way I hadn't seen on her face in decades. She looked so young, so full of hope and possibility. Tucked behind the photo was a letter I'd forgotten existed. My parents had written it to both of us that August, explaining their decision about college funding. I read it again in the harsh light of my kitchen at 2 a.m, and the language that had seemed perfectly reasonable when I was 20 now felt like a guillotine blade. We've given this careful consideration, and we believe the family's resources should be concentrated where they'll provide the greatest return. Christina's Harvard MBA will position her to eventually lead Walsh Corporation and secure all our futures. Sarah's art degree, while we respect her talent, doesn't offer the same strategic value. We're confident Sarah will understand this is for the good of the family. I remembered receiving this letter. I'd been at a friend's apartment in Cambridge preparing for my junior year at Harvard. I'd read it, felt a vague discomfort about Sarah having to give up Parsons, then rationalized it away. The MBA was more important. The family business needed someone with serious financial training. Sarah would get over her disappointment and find something else she loved. I'd been so absorbed in my own trajectory that I never called Sarah to ask how she felt, never visited her that summer to see if she was okay, never questioned whether our parents' utilitarian calculus had just destroyed my sister's dreams to fund my own. The hardest question I'd been avoiding for months finally forced itself into clarity. Am I partially responsible for creating the monster Sarah became? If I'd stood up for her back then, if I'd insisted our parents find a way to support both of us, if I'd seen Sarah as a whole person with her own legitimate dreams, rather than just an acceptable sacrifice for family optimization, would any of this have happened? I didn't know the answer. What I did know was that I'd been complicit in Sarah's first great injustice, the wound that had apparently festered for 25 years into the hatred that now defined our relationship. But there was another complicity I needed to face, one that was more recent and more directly my responsibility. I thought about every moment over the past 7 years when I'd chosen silence over confrontation. The 2019 conference speech where Sarah had stood on stage and claimed my work as her own, I'd watched it alone in my office, stunned into inaction. I could have written to the conference organizers immediately, could have demanded a correction, could have contacted the industry publications that covered it. Instead, I'd stayed quiet. The family dinners where my father toasted Sarah as the savior of Walsh Corporation, while I sat 3 feet away saying nothing. The board meetings where she presented my crisis management methodologies as her own innovations, and I nodded along. The Forbes article, the speaking invitations, the NREA keynote selection, at each point I'd had opportunities to speak up, to correct the record, to insist on truth. And at each point, I'd chosen the easier path of silence. I'd told myself this was wisdom, maturity, taking the high road. I'd convinced myself that speaking up would be petty or attention-seeking, that it would violate the role I'd perfected over 45 years as the daughter who didn't make demands. But sitting alone at 2 a.m, staring at that photo of 16-year-old Sarah holding her Parsons letter, I finally saw my silence for what it actually was. Not nobility, not maturity, not gracious restraint. It was cowardice dressed up in respectable clothing. Every time I'd failed to speak, I'd given Sarah permission to take more. I'd enabled the construction of an elaborate lie brick by brick, until the false structure was so large and so established that challenging it seemed impossible. I'd been complicit in my own erasure. Worse than the personal cost was what my silence had taught others. Young women in business who saw Sarah's fabricated success story might think that's how you get ahead, by being good at self-promotion, rather than actual work, by claiming credit that isn't yours, by understanding that the truth is whatever story people choose to believe. My silence hadn't just hurt me, it had perpetuated a model of success built on fraud. But then, as dawn started to break over San Francisco, and I was still sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by old photos and painful realizations, something shifted in my thinking. Yes, I bore some responsibility for what happened when Sarah was 16. Yes, my years of silence had enabled her fraud. But Sarah hadn't stolen credit in a moment of weakness or opportunism. She'd planned it methodically over years. She'd altered legal documents in 2021, 3 years after the crisis, with calculated precision. She'd built an entire infrastructure of lies complete with fabricated evidence. And now she was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent to protect those lies. That wasn't a wounded child acting out. That was a 41-year-old woman committing premeditated fraud. Understanding Sarah's pain didn't mean I had to accept her actions. I could have compassion for the 16-year-old who lost her dream while still holding accountable the adult who'd chosen to respond to that loss by destroying someone else. And I realized something else. Something that felt like a door opening in a room I'd been locked in for decades. I didn't need my family's approval to know my worth. I'd spent 45 years seeking validation from parents who'd never really seen me trying to earn recognition that was always just out of reach. But my value wasn't determined by whether my father toasted me at dinner or whether my mother acknowledged my contributions. It came from something deeper, from knowing I'd done the right thing, even when no one was watching, from having integrity, even when it cost me. I needed to stand up for truth now, not to win my family's love, not to get credit or recognition, but because staying silent any longer would mean betraying the person I actually was beneath all the conditioning and fear. Sometimes the only way forward is through the fire, even if you emerge burned. By Monday morning, I'd made my decision. I called Robert Chen at 8 o'clock before I could second-guess myself. "I'm not submitting to their psychiatric evaluation," I said without preamble, "and I need you to help me go on the offensive." There was a brief pause, then Robert's voice came back measured but approving. "Tell me what you're thinking." We met at his office 3 hours later. I'd brought a letter from my primary care physician, Dr. Amanda Chen, whom I'd seen for a routine physical just 2 weeks earlier. The letter was straightforward and clinical. "Christina Walsh is my patient and is in excellent mental and physical health. She exhibits no signs of psychological distress, cognitive impairment, or any condition that would affect her professional judgment. She is fully capable of making sound decisions regarding her personal and professional affairs." "I want to respond to the board's request formally," I told Robert, declining the evaluation but making it clear exactly what Sarah is doing, weaponizing mental health concerns to avoid accountability for fraud. "I'm done playing defense." Robert nodded slowly. "Refusing the evaluation is risky. The board could interpret it as confirming their concerns." "Let them," I said, and I meant it. I'd rather be seen as difficult than submit to a humiliating examination designed to discredit me. Sarah's betting that I'll be too afraid of looking unstable to refuse. I'm calling that bluff. We drafted the response letter together. It was 2 pages, professional but firm. I declined the evaluation on the grounds that it represented an inappropriate weaponization of mental health concerns in what is fundamentally a corporate governance dispute. I attached Dr. Chen's letter and added a paragraph that Robert crafted with particular care. "I have concerns about the process by which this request was made and the motivations behind it. I believe this matter would be better addressed through proper corporate governance channels, rather than through medical evaluation of individual executives." But declining the psychiatric evaluation wasn't enough. We needed to shift the battlefield entirely to take the fight out of Sarah's controlled environment and into neutral territory. "What if we call for a special shareholders meeting?" I asked. "As a significant shareholder, I have that right. We request an independent audit of the 2018 restructuring records. Third-party firm, no family connections, full forensic examination. The audit gets presented at the meeting, and shareholders vote on any necessary corrective actions." Robert leaned back in his chair, considering. "That bypasses the board entirely. You're not asking them to investigate Sarah. You're using your shareholder rights to demand transparency. It's elegant." "It also creates a formal record," I added. "Everything that gets presented at that meeting becomes part of the corporate documentation. If we need to pursue litigation later, we'll have a foundation." Over the next week, Robert and I built the framework for what would essentially be corporate warfare. We identified Bennett and Associates as the audit firm nationally respected, no California clients that might create conflicts, strong reputation for forensic accounting. We drafted the shareholder resolution requesting the audit. We prepared the formal notice that would be sent to all shareholders announcing the special meeting. But I also understood that once we filed this resolution, Sarah would know exactly what was coming. She'd have time to prepare her defenses to rally board members to construct whatever counter-narrative she could devise. So I spent those same days preparing for every angle of attack she might use. I went through my own financial records with obsessive care, looking for anything Sarah might try to weaponize against me. Every tax return, every bank statement, every investment transaction for the past 10 years. I documented them, organized them, made sure there was nothing she could twist into evidence of poor judgment or instability. I started keeping detailed records of every interaction with family members. When my mother called to ask why I'd refused the psychiatric evaluation, I recorded the date, time, and substance of our conversation. When my father sent an email expressing disappointment, I saved it in multiple locations. I was building my own paper trail now, protecting myself against future misrepresentations. I also did something strategic. I reached out to Tom Harrison, the CFO, and asked to meet him for coffee. Tom had been with Walsh Corporation for 18 years. He was fundamentally a decent man who valued integrity, and I knew Sarah's fraud bothered him even if he'd never said so directly. Over coffee in a quiet cafe in North Beach, I told him what was coming. I'm calling for a special shareholders meeting to request an independent audit of the 2018 restructuring records. The audit will examine whether corporate documents were altered after the fact. I wanted you to know because when this becomes public, you may face pressure to take sides. Tom looked at me for a long moment. Christina, I've known something was wrong for years. I was in those meetings in 2018. I know who did the work. He paused. What do you need from me? Just honesty, I said. When the audit happens, if you're asked about what you witnessed, tell the truth. That's all. He nodded. I can do that. But the most important preparation was internal. I sat with the worst-case scenario and made peace with it. If this shareholders' meeting destroyed my relationship with my parents permanently, I would survive. If the family disowned me completely, I would build a life outside their orbit. If I had to walk away from Walsh Corporation entirely, I would start over at 45 and create something new. I realized that all these years I'd been fighting with one hand tied behind my back because I couldn't bear to lose my family's approval. But Sarah had no such constraint. She was willing to destroy me completely to protect her lies. The only way I could match her was to become equally willing to lose everything. Not because I wanted to burn it all down, but because I needed to stop being controlled by the fear of loss. When you're willing to sacrifice everything for truth, you stop being someone who can be manipulated by threats. When you're willing to lose everything, you become the most dangerous player at the table. The special shareholders meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning in late September, 4 weeks after I'd filed the resolution requesting the independent audit. Those 4 weeks had been some of the longest of my life. Sarah had fought the audit request through every procedural channel available, but ultimately shareholder rights were shareholder rights. The meeting would proceed. I arrived at Walsh Corporation's main conference room 15 minutes early. The space was designed for exactly this kind of high-stakes gathering with a long mahogany table that could seat 20 floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district and video conferencing equipment that allowed remote participants to feel almost present. Robert Chen was already there organizing documents with the methodical precision I'd come to rely on. The other attendees filtered in over the next 10 minutes. The 5 board members all looking varying degrees of uncomfortable. My parents, my father moving slower since his stroke, my mother's face tight with stress. Tom Harrison, the CFO, who nodded at me briefly before taking his seat. And then Sarah arriving exactly at 9 o'clock with her attorney Patricia Vance beside her. Sarah looked impeccable. She wore a navy suit that probably cost $3,000, her hair professionally styled, her makeup flawless. She carried a leather portfolio that I knew would be full of materials to support her version of events. She looked every inch the confident executive who'd saved her family's company and was about to be vindicated by an independent audit. She took her seat across from me, and for just a moment our eyes met. She gave me a small, tight smile that might have been meant as reassurance, or might have been a warning. I couldn't tell which. At precisely 9 o'clock, the video screen flickered to life, and James Bennett appeared. He was the lead auditor from Bennett & Associates, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of calm authority that comes from 40 years of forensic accounting. Behind him, I could see 2 junior auditors who'd worked on the case. "Good morning," Bennett began, his voice clear through the conference speakers. "Thank you all for your time today. Over the past 4 weeks, my team has conducted a comprehensive examination of Walsh Corporation's 2018 restructuring, including all internal documentation, third-party correspondence, and interviews with key stakeholders from that period. Our scope was to verify the accuracy of corporate records and determine the actual sequence of decisions and responsibilities during the crisis." He pulled up the first slide of his presentation. It showed a timeline of the 2018 crisis with key dates marked: the Phoenix development failure, the investor withdrawals, the debt negotiations, the Silvercrest Bridge financing, the business model pivot. "Let me begin by acknowledging what the existing record shows," Bennett said, and I felt my stomach tighten. Walsh Corporation's internal documentation indicates that Sarah Walsh, then marketing director, played a significant role in the company's recovery. Sarah shifted in her seat, sitting up a little straighter. Bennett showed photographs Sarah at the Silvercrest signing ceremony, Sarah presenting at a board meeting, Sarah in what appeared to be a negotiation session. He quoted from meeting notes that mentioned her involvement from emails that included her on distribution lists. "Based on internal records alone," Bennett continued, "one would conclude that Ms. Sarah Walsh was centrally involved in crisis management activities throughout 2018. Sarah nodded slightly, as if this confirmed what she'd been saying all along. I saw my father lean back in his chair, looking relieved. Even some of the board members seemed to relax, as if they'd been worried the audit would create unnecessary family drama, but were glad to see it was supporting the established narrative. Then Bennett's tone shifted. "However, when we examined the timeline more carefully and cross-referenced internal records with third-party sources, we found some significant discrepancies." The next slide showed a detailed breakdown of the Silvercrest capital negotiations. Bennett highlighted 2 columns, per Walsh Corp internal records and per Silvercrest capital records. According to Walsh Corporation's internal documentation, specifically meeting notes and email metadata, Sarah Walsh is listed as the primary contact for the Silvercrest negotiations. However, when we examined Silvercrest's own files, which they provided pursuant to our audit request, we found something different. He pulled up a series of emails, meeting schedules, and negotiation notes, all bearing Silvercrest's letterhead and digital signatures. Every single one listed Christina Walsh, VP Finance, as the primary contact. The meeting notes from their due diligence process specifically named me as the person who'd presented the turnaround strategy. Email threads about deal terms showed me as the sender and receiver of critical negotiations. Silvercrest's records show that Christina Walsh led these negotiations, Bennett said plainly. Their CFO, David Park, confirmed in our interview that he worked exclusively with Christina Walsh throughout the bridge financing process. He stated, and I quote, "I never met Sarah Walsh until after the deal closed." The room had gone very quiet. Sarah's attorney whispered something to her, but Sarah waved her off, her face still composed, but showing the first signs of strain. Bennett continued, methodical and relentless. "Let's look at the creditor restructuring." Another slide appeared showing the 7 different creditors Walsh Corporation had negotiated with. Internal records suggest this was a team effort with Sarah Walsh coordinating. But when we contacted each creditor and reviewed their files, all 7 identified Christina Walsh as their primary negotiator. We have signed correspondence, recorded phone logs, and sworn statements from 4 of the 7 creditors confirming this. The business model pivot to B2B2C came next. Bennett showed a presentation deck, the original file complete with creation metadata showing my name, my laptop ID timestamps from May 2018. This strategic proposal was created by Christina Walsh. The file properties are unambiguous. With each example, I watched the board members' faces transform. William Chen, who'd been so quick to report my witness outreach to Sarah months ago, now looked confused and troubled. Margaret Foster's expression had shifted from skepticism to something approaching shock. Even my father's face showed uncertainty where there had been confidence minutes before. Sarah tried to interrupt. "James, this is being taken out of context. Yes, Christina did technical work, but I was coordinating—" Bennett held up a hand politely. "Ms. Walsh, I appreciate you want to provide context, but I'd ask you to hold your questions until I've completed the presentation. What I'm about to show you will address many of those concerns." He hadn't even gotten to the document alterations yet. That evidence was still coming. But already the room's energy had fundamentally shifted. People were no longer looking at Sarah with sympathy or support. They were looking at her with suspicion, with dawning understanding, with the kind of careful reassessment that happens when you realize someone has been lying to you for years. When the foundation of your lies begins to crack, how long before the entire structure collapses? Bennett was pulling up his next slide when Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her hands were shaking, whether from genuine emotion or calculated performance I couldn't tell, and when she spoke, her voice trembled. "I need to say something before this goes any further." Bennett paused, his cursor hovering over what I knew was the metadata analysis, the forensic proof of document alteration. "Ms. Walsh, I have additional evidence that—" "Please," Sarah interrupted, and now there were actual tears in her eyes. "Just let me explain. Let me give everyone the context they need to understand this." The room went still. Robert Chen leaned forward, slightly alert to danger. Sarah's attorney Patricia looked surprised, as if this wasn't a strategy they'd discussed. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Christina did a lot of the technical work in 2018. I've never claimed otherwise in private conversations." She gestured at the screen showing Bennett's evidence. "These records show she led negotiations, she created strategies, she did the detailed financial work. I'm not denying any of that." I felt confused for a moment, unsure where she was going with this seeming admission. "But what you need to understand," Sarah continued, turning to face our parents directly, "is the context of our family history. Mom, Dad, do you remember when I was 16 years old and got that acceptance letter from Parsons School of Design? My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father's face paled. Do you remember?" Sarah pressed her voice, gaining strength even as tears streamed down her face. "When you sat me down in the library and told me I couldn't accept the scholarship, that the family couldn't afford both the scholarship gap and Christina's Harvard MBA. That Christina's education was the strategic investment and mine was expendable." The silence in the room was absolute. "I gave up my entire future that day," Sarah said. "Art and design wasn't just a hobby for me, it was who I was. It was my passion, my dream, everything I'd worked toward since I was 12 years old. And I sacrificed it so my sister could have her Harvard degree." She turned to look at me now, and the pain in her eyes looked genuine. "I spent 25 years in Christina's shadow, always the less important daughter. Always the one whose dreams didn't matter as much. Always the acceptable sacrifice for the greater good of Christina's career." I wanted to object, to say something, but my throat felt paralyzed. "When 2018 happened," Sarah continued, "when the company was in crisis and Christina did all that work to save it, and then afterward when she chose to stay in the background and let me be the public face of the turnaround, I thought she understood. I thought she knew that this was her way of making things right, of giving me something after I'd given up everything for her." The reframing was masterful. She'd just transformed 7 years of fraud into a family understanding, an informal compensation agreement that Christina had supposedly agreed to. "This was my compensation for the life I sacrificed," Sarah said, her voice breaking completely now. "It was Christina's way of acknowledging what she owed me, and now she wants to take even that away." My mother was crying openly. Eleanor Walsh, who rarely showed emotion, had tears running down her face as she looked between her two daughters. My father spoke, his voice heavy with guilt I'd never heard before. Sarah's right. We did ask her to give up Parsons. We chose Christina's education over Sarah's dreams. He looked at me with something that might have been accusation. We thought it was the right choice for the family, but maybe we weren't fair to your sister. William Chen, the board member who'd been so quick to report my activities to Sarah, was nodding slowly. Family businesses are complicated, he said carefully. Sometimes there are informal understandings about compensation for sacrifices made. Margaret Foster added, if there was an agreement between the sisters about public credit. The room was slipping away from me. Sarah had done something I hadn't anticipated. She'd reframed her fraud not as theft, but as the claiming of a debt owed. She'd weaponized real family trauma, real pain that she'd genuinely suffered to justify criminal acts she'd committed as a 41-year-old woman. And it was working. People in this room were starting to see her not as a perpetrator of fraud, but as a victim seeking belated justice. Robert Chen caught my eye, his expression grave. He understood what was happening. Sarah wasn't fighting legal charges anymore. She was fighting for moral justification. And by invoking genuine trauma from when she was 16, she'd made it almost impossible for me to hold her accountable without appearing heartless, without seeming like the privileged older sister who'd benefited from injustice and now refused to acknowledge the debt. How do you call out a crime when the criminal is also a victim? I'd been silent for 20 minutes watching Sarah's performance, feeling the room's sympathy shift toward her. Now I stood, and my voice when I spoke was quieter than I expected, but steady. Sarah is right about one thing. Everyone turned to look at me. She was sacrificed when we were teenagers, and I was too self-absorbed at 20 to recognize her pain. I was so focused on my own future that I never asked how she felt about losing Parsons. I never questioned whether our parents' decision was fair. I just accepted it because it benefited me. I looked directly at my sister. For that, Sarah, I am truly sorry. I saw surprise flicker across her face. This wasn't the response she'd expected. But Sarah, I continued, my voice gaining strength. You were 32 years old when you started stealing credit for my work. You were 37 when you systematically altered corporate documents to erase my contributions. The 16-year-old girl who lost her dream doesn't justify the 37-year-old woman who committed fraud. Sarah's tears stopped. Her face went very still. You had 25 years to tell me you were angry, I said. You could have confronted me at any point. You could have demanded acknowledgement, compensation, anything. Instead, you chose to build an elaborate lie to claim work you didn't do to alter legal records. That wasn't a wounded teenager acting out. That was a calculated adult committing crimes. The distinction seemed to land. I saw Margaret Foster sit up straighter, saw William Chen's expression shift from sympathy back to scrutiny. Robert Chen stood then, his voice cutting through the tension. Mr. Bennett, if you could continue with your presentation, specifically the forensic analysis of document modifications. Bennett, who'd been waiting patiently throughout Sarah's emotional performance, advanced to his next slide. What appeared on the screen was a detailed forensic report, dense with technical data but with key findings highlighted in red. On March 15, 2021, Bennett began, 12 critical documents related to the 2018 restructuring were modified. The modifications occurred at 11:47 p.m. from a laptop registered to Sarah Walsh logged in under her credentials, connecting from an IP address that matches her home network in Russian Hill. The screen showed each piece of evidence login records, IP address, verification device, authentication, all pointing to Sarah. The modifications were subtle, Bennett continued. Meeting notes were edited to change phrases like Christina proposed to Sarah proposed. Email metadata was altered to make Sarah appear as the primary sender of key communications. Timestamps were adjusted to obscure the actual sequence of decisions. These weren't accidental changes or routine maintenance. They were systematic falsifications designed to support a false narrative. He pulled up security camera footage from Walsh Corporation's office building. The timestamp showed March 15, 2021, 11:47 p.m. The footage showed Sarah entering the building alone, going to her office, remaining there until 1:30 a.m. She was the only person in the building that entire time. Additionally, Bennett said, and his voice carried a note of significance, Ms. Sarah Walsh signed a family accord on August 12th of this year in which she swore under oath that all corporate records from 2018 were accurate and unaltered. That sworn statement combined with this forensic evidence constitutes perjury. The room was absolutely silent. Sarah sat frozen, her face drained of color. Her attorney Patricia was writing furiously on a legal pad. Then Robert spoke again. We have one more witness who can speak to the actual events of 2018. Mr. Park, are you still with us? The video screen split, and David Park appeared in a second window. He was 69 years old, retired to Sonoma with no stake in this fight and no reason to lie. Robert had interviewed him 3 weeks ago, and Park had agreed to appear today because, as he'd told Robert, the truth matters more than avoiding discomfort. Mr. Park, Robert said formally. Who was your primary point of contact during the Walsh Corporation restructuring in 2018? Park's answer was clear and unequivocal. Christina Walsh. She was the VP of Finance, and she negotiated every major term of the bridge financing deal. I met with her probably 20 times over the course of the due diligence period. I never met Sarah Walsh until after the deal closed at a celebration dinner. He paused, then added something that clearly came from his own conscience. Christina was one of the most competent executives I've worked with in 40 years at Silvercrest. When I started seeing articles last year about Sarah Walsh leading those negotiations, I was confused. I almost reached out to correct the record, but I didn't want to cause family trouble. I regret that silence now. The room remained silent for a long moment after Park's image disappeared from the screen. Then William Chen, the board member who'd been so sympathetic to Sarah minutes earlier, said quietly, "This isn't a family misunderstanding. This is fraud." When every lie is systematically dismantled, what's left? But the truth, Sarah didn't cry. She didn't protest. She didn't make excuses or try to defend herself against the forensic evidence or David Park's testimony. She simply stood, her face completely blank, drained of all emotion. "I need to leave," she said, her voice flat. Patricia Vance, her attorney, reached out to stop her. "Sarah, you should stay. We need to address—" "I need to leave," Sarah repeated, pulling her arm away. She walked to the door with strange mechanical precision, like someone moving through water. Through the glass walls of the conference room, we could all watch her progress down the hallway. She stopped about 20 feet away and just stood there, staring at the wall, her body perfectly still. It wasn't the dramatic breakdown I'd anticipated. No tears, no anger, no theatrical collapse. It was something more unsettling, the quiet implosion of someone who'd been living in a constructed reality that had just shattered completely. She looked like a person who'd woken up and found themselves in a life they didn't recognize. My mother started to rise from her chair. I should go to her. But my father put his hand on her arm. "Let her go, Eleanor. She needs to face this." It was the first time in years I'd heard him hold Sarah accountable for anything. My mother sat back down, though her hands were shaking. William Chen, the board chairman, cleared his throat. The room's attention turned back to him. "I'm calling for an immediate vote to suspend Sarah Walsh from all executive duties pending a complete investigation into these allegations." His voice was formal, businesslike. "All in favor?" 5 hands went up. The vote was unanimous. "Additionally," Chen continued, "Walsh Corporation will issue public corrections to all previous communications that misrepresented the 2018 restructuring. We will be transparent with our shareholders and stakeholders about what actually occurred." He turned to Tom Harrison. "Tom, I'm asking you to work with Bennett and Associates to determine the full scope of the document alterations and whether we need to refer this matter to law enforcement." Tom nodded, his face grave. I'll coordinate with them immediately. Chen looked at Bennett, still on the video screen. Mr. Bennett, in your professional opinion, do Ms. Walsh's actions constitute criminal fraud? Bennett's response was measured but clear. Altering corporate documents and signing a false sworn statement constitute perjury at minimum. Depending on how the district attorney's office interprets the intent and impact, there could be additional charges related to fraud and falsification of business records. These would likely be felonies. The word hung in the air. Felonies. My sister might face criminal charges. The meeting adjourned 20 minutes later. People filed out quietly, no one quite knowing what to say. My parents left without speaking to me, my mother supporting my father as they walked slowly toward the elevators. The board members dispersed already on their phones, no doubt calling their own attorneys to discuss the implications. I found myself alone in my office an hour later, staring out the window at the San Francisco skyline. I'd won. The forensic evidence was irrefutable. David Park's testimony was unimpeachable. Sarah's lies were completely exposed, her fraud documented beyond any doubt. My reputation was restored. The truth was finally officially on the record. But I felt hollow rather than triumphant. I kept thinking about that photo I'd found weeks ago, Sarah at 16 holding her Parsons acceptance letter, her smile radiant with hope. I thought about 25 years of resentment festering in silence, growing from a legitimate grievance into something monstrous. I thought about how I'd never asked her how she felt, never questioned the family's utilitarian calculus, never stood up for her when it might have mattered. There were no real winners in this room today. My family was shattered, probably irreparably. My sister might face criminal prosecution. The truth had come out, but the cost was the complete destruction of relationships that, however flawed and dysfunctional, were still family. A knock on my door pulled me from these thoughts. My father stood there, looking older than I'd ever seen him, leaning heavily on his cane. "Can I come in?" he asked. I nodded, and he lowered himself into the chair across from my desk with visible effort. "You were right," he said after a long silence. "About everything. About what you did in 2018, about Sarah lying about all of it." He looked directly at me for the first time in what felt like years. "I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I didn't believe you when you tried to tell us. I'm sorry we asked you to submit to that psychiatric evaluation." It was the acknowledgement I'd wanted for 7 years, the validation I'd been seeking since I was 8 years old, and learned that my value came from not needing recognition. My father finally was seeing me. But instead of satisfaction or relief, I felt only a deep, aching sadness. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means something." He nodded, then stood slowly. At the door, he paused. "Was it worth it? Destroying the family to prove you were right?" I didn't have an answer for him. He left before I could find one. Is truth worth the price of everything you lose to claim it? The answer to my father's question came in the form of how quickly private truth becomes public spectacle. The story broke 72 hours after the shareholders' meeting. I don't know who leaked it, possibly a board member, possibly someone at Bennett and Associates, possibly even someone who'd watched it happen and couldn't keep quiet about what they'd witnessed. In the age of LinkedIn and Twitter, secrets don't stay contained for long. The first article appeared in the Wall Street Journal's business section on Sunday morning, Family Business Fraud. How one sister stole another's legacy. It was restrained factual, citing anonymous sources familiar with the situation. But it opened the floodgates. By Monday afternoon, Forbes had issued a formal retraction of their 2019 profile. The editor's note was terse and professional. Forbes has learned that substantial elements of our 2019 article, "The Woman Who Saved Walsh Corporation at 32, were based on inaccurate information. We have removed the article from our website and apologize to our readers." Soon. By Tuesday, they'd published a new investigative piece, "The Silent Architect: How Christina Walsh's crisis management genius was stolen by her sister." The reporter Jennifer Chen had done thorough work. She'd interviewed David Park, obtained quotes from 3 of the 7 creditors I'd negotiated with, and somehow gotten access to portions of Bennett's forensic audit. The article laid out the entire timeline with damning clarity: the actual work I'd done, the narrative Sarah had constructed, the document alterations, the perjury. The business world reacted with shock. This wasn't just a family squabble or a misunderstanding about credit. This was systematic fraud involving document falsification and false sworn statements. LinkedIn exploded with commentary from executives, consultants, and business school professors. Some focused on the specifics of the case. Others used it as a launching point for broader discussions about credit theft in corporate America, about how women's contributions are often erased, about the unique pressures of family businesses. The think pieces started appearing by Wednesday. The Sarah Walsh scandal and what it reveals about family business dysfunction. When sibling rivalry becomes corporate fraud. The invisible women of crisis management. Sarah's professional exile was swift and complete. The National Real Estate Association sent a formal letter rescinding her keynote invitation, citing recent revelations that call into question the accuracy of information presented in the selection process. 3 companies where she'd held advisory board positions quietly removed her name from their websites. Harvard Business School pulled the case study that had featured her from their curriculum, sending an apologetic email to Christina, asking if she'd be willing to participate in a revised version. Sarah wasn't formally charged with a crime. The board was still deliberating whether to refer the matter to prosecutors, but her reputation was destroyed. I heard through Tom Harrison that former colleagues who'd once courted her friendship now wouldn't return her calls. She was experiencing what I'd lived through in reverse invisibility, but born of shame rather than neglect. Some people in the industry expressed sympathy for her. I saw comments on LinkedIn suggesting she'd cracked under family pressure, or was a cautionary tale about the impossible expectations placed on younger siblings. Others were less forgiving, calling her a fraud and a liar who'd gotten what she deserved. Meanwhile, I found myself in an uncomfortable spotlight I'd never wanted. The Walsh Corporation board voted unanimously to offer me the CEO position. Interview requests flooded my email: Bloomberg, CNBC, NPR, the Financial Times. Speaking invitations arrived daily. 3 literary agents reached out about book deals. A Wall Street Journal reporter called me a hero of truth, which made me physically wince. I didn't feel heroic. I felt exhausted and hollow and unsure whether anything I'd gained was worth what I'd lost. I declined most interview requests. But I agreed to speak with Rachel Morrison, a business journalist from Bloomberg whose work I'd always respected. We met at a quiet cafe in Russian Hill, and I made one request. I don't want to talk about Sarah personally. I want to talk about the broader issues. Rachel nodded. The systemic problems that allowed this to happen. Exactly. The resulting article focused on how silence enables injustice in family businesses, how women's contributions are systematically erased in male-dominated industries, how the cultural conditioning that tells women to be modest and avoid self-promotion creates vulnerabilities for exploitation. I talked about my own mistakes, staying silent for too long, not advocating for myself, believing competence would speak for itself. The article's headline was, Christina Walsh, Silence Isn't Strength When It Enables Your Own Erasure. It went viral in business circles. My inbox filled with messages from women sharing similar stories: credit stolen by male colleagues, contributions minimized, accomplishments erased. Each message should have felt like validation, but instead they felt like evidence of how widespread the problem was, how many people were living versions of my story. When you get everything you fought for, why does it feel so much like losing? I spent a week considering the CEO position, and every day the answer became clearer, even as it became more difficult to articulate to others. The board had made the offer formally on Monday following the shareholders' meeting. It came with everything I should have wanted: a significant salary increase, full executive authority, a seat at the head of the table my grandfather had built. William Chen called it a chance to write the next chapter of Walsh Corporation's story, the right story this time. But sitting alone in my apartment each night that week, I realized something fundamental: I didn't want it. Not because I couldn't do the job, not because I was afraid or uncertain about my abilities, but because accepting that position would mean building my future on the ruins of my sister's destroyed career, stepping into a role that had become available only because I'd exposed her fraud. Every day as CEO would carry the weight of that origin story. More than that, I realized that for 45 years I'd been trying to prove my worth to my family and to Walsh Corporation, and now finally I had that recognition, but I no longer needed it. I called a press conference for the following Monday. The Walsh Corporation communications team tried to talk me out of making a public statement suggesting I could decline the position quietly. But this decision felt important enough to articulate clearly to make a statement about what success actually meant. The conference room was packed with business journalists, many of whom had been covering the Sarah Walsh scandal for the past 2 weeks. I stood at the podium feeling nervous but certain. "I'm grateful to the Walsh Corporation board for offering me the CEO position," I began. "It's an honor to be considered for a role leading the company my grandfather built. But after careful consideration, I've decided to decline." I could feel the surprise ripple through the room. For 45 years, I've been trying to prove my worth to my family and this company. I finally have that recognition, but I realize I don't actually want it, not on these terms. I don't want to build my future on my sister's ruins, even if she built her success on my silence. More importantly, I've learned that I don't need anyone's approval to know my value. I saw reporters typing rapidly, phones recording every word. "I'm choosing to define success differently," I said. "Success isn't about titles or positions or family approval. It's about building something with integrity on your own terms that reflects who you actually are rather than who others want you to be." The questions that followed ranged from supportive to skeptical. One reporter from Business Insider called it the most inspirational career decision of the year. Another from the Financial Times suggested I was self-sabotaging. My parents, I heard later, were bewildered and hurt, interpreting my decision as rejection of the family itself rather than rejection of a specific role. But for the first time in my life, I felt genuinely free. The next day, I announced the launch of Walsh Advisory, a consultancy specializing in crisis management and corporate restructuring for family businesses. My pitch was different from typical crisis management firms. I help family businesses survive both financial crises and the relationship fractures that often accompany them. I understand the spreadsheets, but I also understand the psychology, the unspoken dynamics, the old resentments, the way family dysfunction can destroy sound business strategy. Within 2 weeks, I had 3 clients. The first was referred by David Park, who'd stayed in touch after his testimony at the shareholders' meeting. A second came through one of the Silvercrest executives I'd worked with in 2018. The third found me through the Bloomberg article, a family-owned manufacturing company in Oregon that was facing both financial pressure and a bitter dispute between 2 brothers. I was building something entirely mine with no family baggage attached, no history of dysfunction embedded in its foundation. The Walsh Corporation board responded with more grace than I expected. They offered a generous severance package and retained shares in the company, ensuring I'd benefit from the company's future success without being operationally involved. They hired an external CEO, a woman named Patricia Morrison, with no family connections, which was probably the healthiest thing that could happen to Walsh Corporation. Tom Harrison, the CFO who'd supported me quietly throughout this entire ordeal, took me to lunch the week after my announcement. "You just taught everyone here something important," he said. "Success isn't about titles or family approval. It's about integrity and autonomy. You walked away from the position everyone expected you to take, and somehow that makes you more powerful than if you'd accepted it." He was right. By refusing to follow the expected script, by choosing my own path rather than the one laid out for me, I'd claimed a type of power I'd never had while trying to please everyone. What does rebuilding look like when you're starting from ashes of your own choosing? The answer to that question came unexpectedly 6 months later on a Saturday morning in March. I'd developed a routine by then. Walsh Advisory was thriving with 7 employees and 12 active clients. On weekends, I allowed myself mornings off, usually spent at a beachside cafe in Pacifica, where I could watch the ocean and read without interruption. It had become my sanctuary, a place where no one knew who I was or cared about Walsh Corporation's scandal. I was absorbed in a book about organizational psychology when I sensed someone standing beside my table. I looked up and my breath caught. Sarah stood there holding a paper coffee cup, looking so different from the polished executive I'd last seen at the shareholders' meeting that it took me a moment to fully register it was her. She wore jeans and a plain sweater, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked older, thinner, exhausted. For several seconds, we just stared at each other. I thought she might turn and leave. Part of me hoped she would. Instead, she asked quietly, "Can I sit?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. Sarah lowered herself into the chair across from me, set down her coffee with hands that shook slightly, and for a full minute neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't entirely hostile either. It was the silence of two people who'd caused each other enormous pain and didn't know where to begin addressing it. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I'm not going to apologize." I felt myself tense, but she continued before I could respond. "Not because I'm not sorry, but because sorry feels insultingly inadequate for what I did. What possible apology covers 7 years of fraud-altered documents trying to have you declared mentally incompetent?" Her voice was flat matter-of-fact. "There isn't one." It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years, maybe decades. "So I'm not going to insult you with an apology," she continued. "I just wanted you to know I'm in therapy twice a week. I've been going since a week after the shareholders' meeting, dealing with things I should have dealt with 25 years ago." I waited, saying nothing. "Walsh Corporation decided not to press criminal charges," Sarah said, and something in her voice made me understand she knew I'd been the one to request that mercy. "But I had to repay $400,000 in bonuses and speaking fees I received under false pretenses. The IRS is involved now too, since I'd already paid taxes on that money as income." She gave a hollow laugh. "I'm not working. No one in commercial real estate will touch me. I'm living off savings and selling my condo because I can't afford it anymore." She looked directly at me then, and I saw something I'd never seen in my sister's eyes before: genuine clarity without defensiveness. "I destroyed my career and our family for what? To feel important, to punish you for something that wasn't even your fault." She shook her head. "You were 20 years old when I lost Parsons. You were a kid yourself, focused on your own future like any 20-year-old would be. I spent 25 years hating you for not saving me from a choice our parents made." The insight was striking precisely because it was something Sarah had never been able to see before: the distinction between being hurt by our parents' decision and blaming me for it. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. "I do feel guilt about not seeing your pain back then. I was so absorbed in my own path that I never asked how you felt, never questioned whether the family's decision was fair. That was wrong of me." Sarah looked like she might cry. "But Sarah," I continued, my voice gentle but firm, "you were 32 years old when you started stealing credit for my work. You were 37 when you altered those documents. That's not the wounded teenager acting out anymore, that's an adult making calculated, destructive choices. I can have compassion for where your anger came from without accepting what you did with it." She nodded slowly as if she'd expected this. "I hope you find peace," I said, and I meant it. "I hope therapy helps you work through the trauma from our childhood, helps you understand yourself better. But I can't be part of your healing journey. Our relationship is too damaged. I've worked too hard to build a life that isn't defined by family dysfunction." "I understand," Sarah said quietly. "I forgive you." I added because it was true. "But I don't trust you, and I'm not sure I ever will again. Those are two different things." Sarah stood picking up her coffee cup. "Thank you for being honest." She walked out of the cafe and I watched her go, feeling a complicated mixture of sadness and relief. Can some betrayals ever truly be forgiven or only survived? The answer evolved over the next 2 years as I discovered what life looked like when you stopped seeking validation from people who'd never truly see you. Walsh Advisory grew faster than I'd anticipated. What started as 3 clients in my first month became a steady stream of family businesses seeking help navigating crises that were equal parts financial and relational. By the end of the first year, I'd hired 12 employees. By the end of the second year, we occupied an entire floor of a renovated building in San Francisco's financial district with 25 people on staff and a waiting list of potential clients. The work was intense but deeply satisfying in ways Walsh Corporation had never been. I wasn't just restructuring debt and negotiating with creditors, I was helping families understand how their dysfunction was destroying their businesses, teaching them to separate legitimate financial strategy from old resentments and power struggles. My pitch to potential clients was always honest. I can help you save your business, but only if you're willing to examine the family patterns that put it at risk in the first place. My reputation developed into something I'd never sought but had somehow earned brilliant with numbers, but also deeply empathetic about the psychology underlying family business failures. Fortune magazine featured me in their 40 over 40 list, a collection of influential businesswomen who'd found success later in life. The article's headline read, "Christina Walsh Turning Personal Betrayal into Professional Wisdom." Reading that profile felt surreal. The Christina Walsh described in those pages, confident, successful, sought after, bore little resemblance to the woman who'd stood invisible in the corner at her sister's wedding just 2 years earlier. The most unexpected honor came in November when Harvard Business School invited me to deliver a keynote address on crisis management and family business dynamics. Standing backstage before my speech, I thought about the 20-year-old version of myself who'd sat in these same lecture halls, absorbing lessons about business strategy while missing completely the lessons about family and self-worth that would matter so much more. When I walked onto that stage and saw 800 faces looking back at me, students, faculty, business leaders, I felt nervous in a way I hadn't experienced in years. But then I remembered why I'd agreed to do this. For most of my life, I began. I believed silence was strength and invisibility was virtue. I was raised to think that self-sufficiency meant not needing recognition, that competence would speak for itself, that doing the right thing mattered more than being acknowledged for it. The room was absolutely quiet. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I was just good enough at what I did, truth would speak for itself. I was catastrophically wrong. Truth doesn't speak. People speak truth or they allow lies to flourish. And when you stay silent in the face of injustice, even injustice done to you, you become complicit in your own erasure. I shared my story then, not the dramatic version that had appeared in business publications, but the quieter, more personal truth about conditioning and fear, and the cost of seeking approval from people who would never give it. The most important crisis I ever managed, I said near the end of my speech, wasn't the $4 million in debt or the restructuring plan that saved Walsh Corporation. It was the crisis of my own silence. Learning to speak truth, to advocate for myself, to stop equating self-sacrifice with worthiness, that was the real work. The standing ovation surprised me. But what surprised me more were the women who approached afterward, mostly in their 20s and 30s, sharing their own stories of being overlooked, having credit stolen, learning to stay quiet to avoid being labeled difficult. I gave each of them the same advice: speak your truth early before silence becomes a habit you can't break. My life had expanded in other ways too. Filling spaces I hadn't known were empty. I'd developed genuine friendships with 3 clients, women in their 50s who'd navigated their own family business crises and understood the particular exhaustion that comes from that kind of battle. We met monthly for dinners that had nothing to do with work, just shared laughter and the comfortable honesty that comes from mutual understanding. I'd started painting again, something I'd loved in college, but abandoned because it felt frivolous compared to building a career. Now my apartment walls held my own abstract work, not good enough to sell, but good enough to bring me joy. And I was dating Michael, a divorced architect I'd met at a friend's dinner party. He knew nothing about Walsh Corporation or the scandal, had never read the Forbes article, didn't care about my professional reputation. He just liked talking to me about art and architecture and terrible sci-fi movies. It was casual, undefined, and refreshingly uncomplicated. At 47, I was finally becoming the person I was meant to be before family dysfunction had shaped me into someone small and silent and accommodating. But can success ever fully heal the wound of family betrayal? The answer to that question arrived 3 months later in the form of a phone call from Tom Harrison. "Christina, I need to ask you something," he said without preamble. "Walsh Corporation is in trouble again." My first instinct was to feel a flash of vindication. They'd replaced me, and now they were struggling. But Tom quickly clarified that this wasn't about my absence. The external CEO they'd hired, Patricia Morrison, had made decisions regarding environmental impact assessments at a new development project that were now being investigated by both state regulators and environmental advocacy groups. The company was facing potential lawsuits, regulatory fines, and a PR disaster that was threatening relationships with key investors and municipal partners. "The board is meeting tomorrow to discuss crisis management," Tom said. "Your name came up." "I'm sure it did," I said carefully. "Christina, I know we have no right to ask, but would you consider consulting on this? Not as an employee, as an outside advisor. We'd pay your firm's full rate." I told him I'd think about it. The call that made my decision came 3 hours later from my father. Richard Walsh was 76 now, his health declining since a second minor stroke 6 months earlier. His voice on the phone was weaker than I remembered. "Christina," he said, and I heard something I'd never heard before: humility. "I know I have no right to ask this. I know I didn't believe you when you needed me to, didn't support you when I should have. But the company your grandfather built is in trouble, and I'm asking, not expecting, asking if you'll help us." The distinction mattered. He was asking, not demanding, requesting, not assuming I owed the family my expertise. I took 24 hours to consider, then called Tom back with my answer. "I'll consult for Walsh Corporation for 6 months, I said. "Standard consulting contract paid at Walsh Advisory's market rate. I'm not rejoining the company, I'm providing external expertise." "That's more than fair," Tom said, relief evident in his voice. "I have one additional condition," I added. "Name it." "I want Sarah to be part of the solution." The silence on Tom's end lasted at least 5 seconds. "Christina, the board would never approve—" "Hear me out," I interrupted. "Sarah has real talent in marketing and creative strategy. Those talents were never fully utilized at Walsh Corporation because she was too busy trying to prove herself in areas where she had no expertise. This crisis requires a comprehensive rebranding. Hire her as creative director for the project. Give her a chance to contribute honestly using skills she actually possesses." Tom was quiet, processing. "You're serious?" "Completely. If the board won't agree to this condition, I won't take the consulting engagement." It took 3 days of board deliberation, but eventually they agreed. I think they were so desperate for help that they would have agreed to almost anything. Sarah's response came through her attorney rather than directly. She was initially suspicious, apparently convinced this was some elaborate form of public humiliation. But when the terms were explained, a genuine creative director position, fair compensation, a defined 6-month project, she cautiously accepted. The work began in January. I came into Walsh Corporation 3 days a week to meet with the executive team, review documentation, and develop the crisis response strategy. Sarah worked separately, reporting to a different chain of command, focused entirely on the creative rebranding campaign. We barely spoke to each other during those 6 months. Most communication went through Tom Harrison, who became an inadvertent intermediary. When we passed in hallways, we exchanged brief nods, but nothing more. But Sarah did excellent work. The rebranding campaign she developed was creative, authentic, and strategically sound. She created messaging that acknowledged Walsh Corporation's environmental misstep without being defensive, that committed to higher standards without sounding hollow. It was the kind of work she should have been doing all along instead of trying to claim credit for financial strategy she didn't understand. By June, the crisis was contained. The regulatory issues were resolved through a settlement. The rebranding had successfully repositioned Walsh Corporation as a company learning from mistakes rather than one trying to hide them. Investor confidence was restored. On the last day of my consulting engagement, I received a brief email from Sarah. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth salvaging. I won't waste it." 5 sentences. No elaborate apology. No request for reconciliation. Just acknowledgement. I read it 3 times, then saved it in a folder I labeled simply "Forward." It wasn't closure. It wasn't forgiveness in the traditional sense. But it was a small step toward both of us healing separately in our own ways. Sometimes the greatest revenge is refusing to let someone else's worst moment define their entire life. The answer to that question began to emerge 4 months later when I received an invitation to appear on Second Act, a podcast that focused on professionals who'd reinvented themselves after 40. The host, Rebecca Martinez, had a reputation for thoughtful, in-depth interviews that went beyond surface-level career advice. We recorded the episode in her studio in Oakland on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. After we'd discussed the basics of my story, the fraud, the confrontation, the decision to start Walsh Advisory, Rebecca asked a question that made me pause. If you could go back and change one thing, what would it be? Most people expected me to say I'd confront Sarah earlier, or document my work better, or refuse to stay silent. But that wasn't my answer. I wouldn't change confronting Sarah or exposing the fraud that was necessary. I said, I'd change how I handled things when she was 16. I'd have paid attention to her pain instead of being absorbed in my own life. I'd have questioned whether our parents' decision was fair. I'd have asked her how she felt about losing Parsons. Rebecca looked surprised. Even though that might not have prevented what happened later, even though I confirmed, because Sarah still made her own choices as an adult. Her fraud wasn't my responsibility, but my negligence when she was 16, that was mine. We underestimate how much unacknowledged pain can poison a person over time. Not everyone responds to pain by committing fraud, obviously, but everyone deserves to have their pain witnessed and validated, especially by family. The conversation evolved into something deeper than I'd anticipated. Rebecca asked me what I'd learned from the entire experience, and I found myself articulating 3 lessons that had crystallized over the past 3 years. First, I said silence isn't strength when it allows injustice to flourish. I spent 45 years believing that staying quiet was noble, that speaking up for myself would be selfish or attention-seeking. But silence in the face of injustice isn't humility, it's complicity. Speaking truth might cost you relationships, but those relationships were already broken if they required your silence to survive. Rebecca nodded, taking notes. Second, I continued, you don't need family validation to have value. This one took me the longest to learn. For 45 years, I sought my parents' recognition. I structured my entire identity around being the daughter who didn't need attention, thinking that self-sufficiency would eventually be rewarded with acknowledgement. When I finally stopped needing their approval, when I walked away from the CEO position they expected me to want, that's when I found actual freedom. And third, Rebecca prompted, understanding why someone hurt you doesn't mean accepting that they had the right to hurt you, I said. I have genuine compassion for what Sarah went through as a teenager. That trauma was real, and my family's decision to sacrifice her dreams for my education was profoundly unfair. But understanding her pain doesn't obligate me to excuse her fraud or accept her back into my life unconditionally. Compassion and boundaries can coexist. The podcast episode went live 2 weeks later and resonated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Within 3 days, my inbox contained over 200 emails. Women, mostly over 50, shared their own stories. Daughters whose brothers had inherited the family business despite being less qualified. Executives whose male colleagues had claimed their ideas in meetings. Mothers whose decades of sacrifice had gone unacknowledged and uncompensated. Scientists whose research had been credited to senior male professors. Each story was different in its specifics, but familiar in its fundamental pattern: invisible labor, stolen credit, enforced silence. I read every email, and I started to understand that my story had become a catalyst for a larger conversation about whose contributions get recognized and whose get systematically erased. That's when I developed the idea for Finding Your Voice After Silence, a quarterly workshop specifically designed for women in family businesses who felt invisible. The curriculum combined practical strategies: how to document your work, how to advocate effectively, how to navigate family dynamics, with deeper work around unlearning the conditioning that taught us to stay small. The first workshop in September had 40 attendees held in a rented conference room in San Francisco. Women flew in from Oregon, Arizona, Nevada, even Texas. We spent 2 days sharing stories, developing strategies, and building a support network. By the end of the year, I was running the workshop in 4 cities. By the following spring, it had expanded to a nationwide program with local facilitators I'd trained. The demand was overwhelming, which told me something important. There were thousands of women carrying versions of my story, women who'd spent careers being overlooked and were finally ready to be seen. When your pain becomes purpose, has it all been worth it? The answer revealed itself completely on a warm evening in October, 3 years after that shareholders' meeting that had changed everything. I stood on the balcony of my beachfront estate, the same Mediterranean villa where Sarah's wedding had taken place, where I'd been dismissed as the beach cleaner, where Marcus had called me Madam, and momentarily shattered the illusion of my invisibility. But tonight was entirely different. Tonight I was hosting the launch party for the Silent Architects Fellowship, a program I'd spent 6 months developing with funding from Walsh Advisory's profits and grants from 3 major foundations. The fellowship would provide financial support and mentorship to women whose contributions in family businesses had been systematically overlooked or erased. We'd received over 300 applications for the first cohort. We'd selected 50. Those 50 women were here tonight, along with mentors, board members, and supporters. The event was deliberately understated: no $98,000 budget, no crystal chandeliers or imported roses. Instead, we'd set up simple tables on the lawn overlooking the Pacific, with string lights creating a warm glow as dusk approached. The atmosphere was one of genuine connection rather than performative networking. I watched small clusters of women deep in conversation, sharing their stories, building the kind of solidarity that comes from mutual understanding. I was 48 now, and I barely recognized the woman I'd been 3 years ago. That Christina had worn invisibility like armor, had equated silence with strength, had spent her entire life seeking approval from people who would never truly see her. This Christina wore a cream-colored dress that made her feel confident rather than invisible, stood in the center of her own event rather than hiding in corners, and smiled with genuine joy that reached her eyes. Marcus approached with a tray of champagne just as he had at Sarah's wedding. "Madam Walsh," he said with the same dignified formality, "shall I begin serving dinner?" But this time there was no confusion, no need for explanation. Everyone here knew exactly who I was. Several guests nearby smiled at the exchange, understanding the history without needing it explained. "Yes, please, Marcus," I said. "Thank you for everything tonight." As he walked away, a young woman approached nervously. She was 23, maybe 24, with dark hair pulled back and intelligent eyes that reminded me of myself at that age. "Ms. Walsh, I'm Emily Chen. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," I said, smiling. "Please call me Christina. I'm a second-year MBA student at Harvard." Emily said the words coming out in a rush. "I wrote my thesis on your 2018 restructuring plan for Walsh Corporation. My professor used it as a case study in crisis management. I learned more from studying your work than from any textbook we were assigned." Something in my chest tightened with emotion I hadn't expected. This was why it had mattered. Not to win my father's approval or receive my mother's acknowledgement or claim a CEO title I didn't actually want, but so that the next generation would have a different example, would know that truth was worth fighting for, would see that success didn't require silence or self-erasure. "Thank you for saying that," I managed. "It means more than you know." "I applied for the fellowship because I'm in a similar situation," Emily continued. "My family has a manufacturing business in San Jose. My older brother is being groomed to take over, even though I'm the one with the business degree and the strategic vision. Everyone just assumes he's the natural successor because he's male." She paused. "Your story gave me permission to fight for what I've earned, instead of accepting what they're willing to give me." I took her hand. "Don't ever let anyone else tell your story, Emily. Write it yourself, and write it loudly enough that no one can pretend they didn't hear." She nodded, eyes bright with determination. As the evening progressed, I moved through the crowd, talking with fellowship recipients, hearing their stories, feeling the weight of what we were building together. Each woman carried her own version of invisibility, her own experience of having contributions erased or credit stolen. But they were all here now, visible and valued, building a network that would support them in ways our families and companies never had. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep pink, I stepped back onto the balcony alone for a moment. The view was identical to the one from Sarah's wedding 3 years ago. The same ocean, the same coastline, the same angle of light. But I was seeing it through completely different eyes. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text from a number I hadn't heard from in months. "Sarah. I saw the article about the fellowship in the Times. What you're building is important. I'm proud of you, even if I have no right to be." I stared at the message for a long moment, reading it 3 times. Part of me wanted to respond immediately. Part of me wanted to delete it. Instead, I did something that felt more honest. I saved it in a folder without replying. Some things still needed time. Maybe Sarah and I would find our way to some version of reconciliation eventually. Maybe we wouldn't. But my peace, my success, my sense of self-worth, none of those things depended on whether my sister and I ever repaired our relationship. I looked back at the party happening on my lawn. 50 women who'd been invisible were now seen. Hundreds more would be supported through the fellowship in years to come. Walsh Advisory was thriving, helping family businesses navigate both financial crises and the relationship fractures that so often accompanied them. I'd built all of this not by seeking approval or staying silent or making myself small, but by standing up, speaking truth, and refusing to let anyone else define my value. The woman who'd stood in this same spot 3 years ago, dismissed as the beach cleaner at her own property, felt like a stranger to me now. That Christina had been desperate for recognition, terrified of conflict, willing to sacrifice her truth for the illusion of family peace. This Christina, the one standing here at 48 with the Pacific sunset painting, everything gold, was peaceful and powerful and finally truly visible. Not because anyone had given her permission to be seen, but because she'd stopped needing permission. Marcus appeared beside me one more time. "The dinner service is complete, madam. Is there anything else you need this evening?" I looked at the women laughing and talking on the lawn at the life I'd built from the ashes of the old one at the sunset that seemed to promise that tomorrow would be just as beautiful as today. "No, Marcus," I said softly. "I have everything I need. Some victories aren't about defeating your enemies. They're about becoming someone who no longer needs the battles to define you." So there you have it. Christina Walsh's journey from invisibility to empowerment, from silence to truth, from seeking approval to building her own definition of success. When I first came across Christina's story, what struck me wasn't just the dramatic fraud or the courtroom-worthy confrontation. It was something quieter and more universal, the way she'd spent 45 years making herself small, believing that self-sacrifice was the same as virtue, convinced that if she just worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, eventually someone would notice and acknowledge her worth. How many of us have lived some version of that story? Maybe you weren't the VP of finance who saved a company from bankruptcy. Maybe your sister didn't alter corporate documents to steal your credit. But perhaps you've been the daughter who gave up her dreams so a brother could pursue his. Or the employee whose ideas were claimed by a male colleague in meetings. Or the mother whose decades of sacrifice went unacknowledged while everyone praised your husband for helping out with his own children. Or the woman who learned early that taking up space, speaking up, demanding recognition made you difficult, aggressive, unfeminine. Christina's story resonates because it's not really about corporate fraud. It's about something much deeper. The cost of silence, the price of seeking validation from people who will never truly see you, and the extraordinary courage it takes to finally say, enough. Let's talk about what we can learn from her journey, because I believe there are lessons here that matter far beyond the world of family businesses and restructuring plans. First, silence is not always strength. We're taught, especially as women of a certain generation, that keeping the peace is noble, that not making a fuss is mature, that if we're truly confident, we won't need external validation. But Christina's story shows us the dark side of that conditioning. Her silence didn't protect her. It didn't make her family appreciate her more. It simply created a vacuum that someone else filled with lies. Speaking your truth might cost you relationships, but those relationships were already broken if they required your silence to survive. Second, understanding someone's pain doesn't mean you have to accept their right to hurt you. This is perhaps the most nuanced lesson in Christina's story. She genuinely felt guilt about not recognizing Sarah's trauma when they were teenagers. She acknowledged her role in that family dynamic. But she also drew a clear line: Sarah's pain at 16 didn't justify her fraud at 37. Compassion and boundaries can coexist. You can empathize with why someone became who they became while still holding them accountable for what they chose to do. Third, and perhaps most importantly, you don't need anyone's approval to have value. Christina spent 45 years trying to prove her worth to parents who had assigned her the role of the easy one who doesn't need attention. She structured her entire identity around not needing recognition, and it nearly destroyed her. Her real liberation came not when she exposed Sarah's fraud or when the board offered her the CEO position, but when she walked away from the position everyone expected her to want. That's when she claimed her power, not by defeating her enemies, but by becoming someone who no longer needed the battle to define her. What strikes me most about Christina's ending is that it's not triumphant in the traditional revenge story way. She didn't destroy Sarah completely. She didn't get her family back. Her parents never fully acknowledged the depth of their failure. And yet she found something more valuable than vindication. She found freedom. She built a life of meaning on her own terms, helping other women find their voices, creating programs that would prevent the next generation from suffering the same erasure she'd endured. That text from Sarah at the end, "I'm proud of you, even if I have no right to be," Christina saved it, but didn't respond. That ambiguity feels real and honest. Some betrayals don't get neat resolutions. Some relationships don't get healed, they just get survived. And that's okay. You don't owe anyone reconciliation just because they've done some therapy and sent a text. If you're listening to this story and seeing pieces of your own life in Christina's journey, I want you to know something: it's not too late. Whether you're 55 or 75, whether you've been silent for 5 years or 50, you can still choose to speak your truth. You can still set boundaries. You can still decide that your value doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. It might cost you. Christina lost her family relationships, at least in their original form, but she gained herself. And in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up? Have you experienced credit theft in your career or family business? How did you handle it? Or are you still in the middle of your own journey toward finding your voice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story resonated with you, if Christina's journey moved you or made you think differently about silence and worth and family dynamics, please consider subscribing to this channel. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories about resilience, redemption, and the courage it takes to reclaim your truth. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe a daughter struggling with family expectations, or a friend who's been overlooked at work, or a sister who's forgotten her own worth. Leave a comment and let me know what lesson from Christina's story hit you the hardest. Was it learning to speak up, setting boundaries with family, walking away from positions that don't serve you, or something else entirely? Your engagement, your comments, your shares, your stories helps this message reach more women who need to hear it. Because somewhere out there is another Christina standing invisible in the corner of her own life, wondering if she'll ever be seen. Your comment might be the thing that gives her courage to step into the light. Thank you for listening to Christina Walsh's story. Thank you for being here. And remember, some victories aren't about defeating your enemies. They're about becoming someone who no longer needs the battles to define you. Until next time, keep speaking your truth. You're worth being heard.